It's 2025, and it's time once again, you filthy casuals, to test how much you really know about this sport. Get ready to lock the garden shed door.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
And spend 3 days in isolation because the Toyo tires are about to hit the road. Crack open a happy dad, because today we will be utilizing shamanism to conjure up the sport's most evil stories.
Everybody knows he is working with some shamanics.
This is the highly anticipated part 3 of the UFC MMA Iceberg Explained series. I've hid in the shadows conducting my MMA lore research, and it's time to expose all that I have learned since the last Iceberg video.
Like Shama.
Shama.
This is not your average stroll through the world of mixed martial arts. Today we are excavating the obscure past of this sport, digging up the disturbing recollection of CTE-infused fighters, and placing our tinfoil crowns upon our head.
It's gonna be intimate and passionate.
So, let's get John Jones out of the closet. It's time to travel down the rabbit hole. Welcome to the crazy world of MMA, Part 3.
Outside of DC, you've got the best tits.
So you want to see running, go to see the Usain Bolt.
Have you ever been f***ed by an MMA fighter?
Police arrested Gerald Streebent last night following
Take care of your underwears. I'm gonna you, man.
Welcome to Tier 1. So again, I'm not going to insult your intelligence with this one, because this tier just has things like Alex Pereira, John Jones and Amanda Nunes in it. We ignored it in the previous 2 versions of this iceberg, and that's exactly what we're going to do again, because we want to get to the nitty gritty, and we want to get to the intricacies of this sport. Tier 1 is just filled with everything that you might expect from the sport's biggest organizations, so it's boring, and we're going to move on. Welcome to Tier 2. Casual fans of this sport might get a little bit lost in this tier, but the hardcores, well, they might indeed just know these entries. Let us know in the comments down below how many of these you know, and maybe ones that surprised you. Let's get on with it. Leslie Smith's ear. It's November 15th, 2014, and number 13th ranked Leslie Smith is fighting to enter into the top 10 by taking on 8th ranked Jessica Ai. Their fight was placed on the prelims of UFC 180. The bout begins, and the girls would proceed to fire punches back and forth at each other for the first 4 minutes. But at around the 4th minute of competition, Ai would throw a combination that would disintegrate Leslie Smith's ear, and I mean quite literally explode it. The slow motion, which I more than likely can't show here on YouTube, otherwise I risk being demonetized, shows her ear split essentially in half, as blood oozes down her face and onto the canvas. She would proceed to finish the round, and even make it to the corner, despite the doctor's concern. I would spend the next couple minutes of the second round targeting the weak point, making it split more and more and more. Eventually Herb Dean would have to step in, pause the fight and ask for a doctor's analysis. Despite Leslie's screaming objections, the fight would ultimately be put to an end, Jessica Ai walking away with the doctor's stoppage. The one, the only. Bruce Buffer might just be the most iconic voice in all of sports. His introductions speak for themselves. He builds the hype before a major fight in ways that are hard to explain, even giving his energy to the fighters themselves, who grow in Buffer's presence. Whilst we have discussed many great stories about Buffer over the course of this series, this one is quite special. Bruce often shines a light on many accolades that fighters have achieved over their career when introducing them. Whether you were a champion of the WEC, a former champion or interim champion of the UFC, a BMF, or even sometimes he might mention a rival organization like Bellator or One Championship. But only 3 fighters ever, according to ESPN, have been introduced as the one and the only, and that is Conor McGregor, John Jones, and perhaps undeservingly, Alex Pereira most recently. But what ESPN, who reported on this, didn't know was the fact that Tank Abbott had actually been introduced as this as well. He was the first one, in fact. I couldn't find the exact fight, but I know that Anderson Silva has also been introduced as the legendary cage fighter at some point as well. Bruce Buffer's ACL. Whilst we're on the subject of Mr. Bruce Buffer himself, it seems only right to chuck in another story of the veteran voice of the Octagon. Buffer really does put everything into his performance, and it is only fitting that the man himself has sacrificed his own health in generating hype. That's right, during his announcement of George St. Pierre and his headline fight at UFC 129, Bruce Buffer would have a little accident. I'll let the man himself explain.
I'm announcing George St. Pierre, right? And so I go, George,
rush. And then he lunges out like always. And I instinctively bunny hop back the way I always do when he does. And my bad ankle wobbled. And when it wobbled, my knee exploded and severed my ACL. And I still remember the click, the snap.
Chandler's emails. Whilst many people seem to have fallen out of love with Chandler over the last few years and completely hate on his personality, I for one just don't get it. He seems like a great guy with a great attitude towards life. And not only that, but he is also quite literally one of the most entertaining fighters that I've ever seen in my life. And I don't think anybody can deny that. His family life has been called into question a fair few times, to say the least, by certain MMA YouTubers, and whilst I can't jive with what is being implied on that front, the funniest thing that I do think is okay to take the piss out of him for is how he ended up getting his doctor wife in the first place, Bree Chandler. So it turns out Michael Chandler, ever the romantic, had actually exchanged emails with his future wife for 2 years. Chandler had bumped into her, well, not her physically, but a photo of her at a dentist's office after getting his tooth knocked out in his freshman year. Looking at the photo of the dentist's daughter, he told himself that that woman would be his future wife, and by God did he not stop until he got exactly what he wanted. It certainly is a strange love story, but let's face it, it's completely in keeping with Chandler, and it's a good job that Chandler has that persistence, because it looks like he'll need that patience to finally achieve his matchup against Conor McGregor. Eddie Hall. Eddie Hall might just be one of the most well-known strongmen the world has ever known, and that is not easily earned. He is a one-time world's strongest man, an online personality with probably some of the best videos coming from that niche, and probably his quite finest feat was when he deadlifted 500 kilograms. He also transitioned into the world of personality boxing, taking on the mountain and world's strongest man Hafthor Bjornsson in what was a fight that Eddie would ultimately lose, but he makes his way onto this iceberg for his freak show MMA fights. Just earlier this year, Eddie would fight in KSW, knocking out his opponent in 30 seconds, notching his professional record to 1-0. But he also took on 2 tiny humans in a fight that is pretty hilarious if I'm honest, left hooking one into the Shadow Realm forever, and then body slamming the second little goblin into the somber night of endless peace. It's a silly little fight, but entertaining nonetheless. I do wonder if we'll see Eddie take part in more MMA competitions in the future. The cursed card. Despite the UFC's best intentions, their cards often fall apart outside of their control. I'm talking pre-COVID here, by the way, because ever since then the UFC has apparently just given up and are on a hot streak of shit with their events as of late. But the less said about that, the better, I guess. One such card that completely and utterly fell apart was one that many consider the most cursed card of all time. I'm of course talking about a little-known pay-per-view of UFC 177. What started as an epic pay-per-view with the headliner of Jon Jones vs Alexander Gustafsson 2, a rematch of their Hall of Fame garnering first matchup, but the bout would ultimately be pushed back to UFC 178, and so the headline of this pay-per-view would be replaced with TJ Dillashaw rematching Renan Barão. After the massive upset that was their first fight at UFC 173, a second title fight was also added to the card, with Demetrius Johnson taking on Carricio. But when Alexander Gustafsson pulled out of UFC 178, he was replaced with Daniel Cormier, and then Jones pulled out of that fight with a leg injury, leaving UFC 178 with no title fight. Demetrius Johnson was then moved from UFC 177 to UFC 178. Are you still with me here? Well, it gets worse. UFC 176 would ultimately be cancelled, the second pay-per-view ever to be cancelled by the UFC. A load of bouts would be moved from UFC 176 to UFC 177, the one that we're talking about, including a fight between Tony Ferguson and Danny Castillo. As the pay-per-view of UFC 177 drew closer, many more fights fell apart, including a matchup between Scott Jorgensen and Henry Cejudo 3 days before the card took place. Then, on the weigh-in days, the title fight would suffer more destruction. Renan Barão would be pulled from the card due to weight-cutting issues, and then would be replaced by divisional nobody and UFC newcomer Joe Soto, a sacrificial lamb for TJ Dillashaw. But that meant that the card lost another fight, as Joe Soto's original opponent was now without a dance partner. At the official weigh-ins, Joe Rogan introduced UFC 177 as the haunted UFC card, and he wasn't wrong.
Thank you very much. Welcome to the haunted UFC card.
The pay-per-view had the fewest fights of any card in the history of the organization, just 8 fights, 3 on the prelims and 5 on the main card. UFC 176 was cancelled, UFC 177 was cursed, and UFC 178 had more title fallouts than any pay-per-view I've seen in a long time, and so it proved to be one of the most cooked sets of events the UFC has ever experienced. MMA Age Curse. During this series we have gone over many of the curses of the UFC, from the dreaded haircut curse to the EA Games front cover curse. This one is probably one of the most well and tested and confirmed curses the sport knows, however, with only a few brave warriors ever besting it. It is said that those men aged over 35 in title fights below welterweight are fighting essentially impossible odds. Only 3 men aged 35 and over out of 24 title fights have ever walked out of the octagon either defending or winning a title. Most recently, Alexander Volkanovski became the 4th man to beat the curse, and in fact, the first man, lightweight and below, to ever beat the curse. He truly is one of the sport's GOATs. On screen now is a list of all of those who have danced in the octagon against this curse, and the result, Dominic Cruz Berger. Chael Sonnen really is one to spin a yarn, but this one always stood out to me when I heard it first. I had no idea why, but considering the video is now 6 years old and only has less than 200,000 views, I would quite like to share it with you guys. So it starts naturally, 3 minutes into a 4-minute video from Chael, because he is never one to get to the point. But essentially, Chael is hanging out with a bunch of ESPN guys and UFC commentators, Dominic Cruz included. They head on over to Burger King as they are all starving. Dominic is ahead of everyone and orders a Whopper. Everyone else in turn places their order, collects their food and then sits down to eat. Chael Sonnen, about to chow down on his chicken sandwich, notices that Dominic Cruz has no food and then asks, "Well, where is it?"
"Dom, where's your food?" He says, I said, "Dom, didn't you get? I thought I saw you order." "It's in my pocket."
He responds with,
"Yeah, I'm gonna eat it later. It's like a protein bar. Think about it. Think of all the protein in that beef."
Perplexed, Chael meets Dominic the next day at the airport and asks if he had consumed his meal, to which Dominic says,
3 in the morning. It was just a junior.
The diet of these athletes in peak physical condition always interests me, and this one just always got me chuckling. It's just a junior. Rest in peace, Joe Rogan. Anyone who has spent any amount of time watching combat sports will know about this meme. Who knows when it started, pre-2011 for sure, but every live chat in every UFC video ever, even one championship, Bellator, PFL and boxing events, doesn't matter. The same comment just gets spammed. Rest in peace, Joe Rogan. Sometimes it's just an endless sea of rest in peace, Joe Rogan comments, and other times it's sparse and sporadic. But you can rest assured, in any live feed, you will see rest in peace, Joe Rogan. This is the MMA community in a nutshell, and may it never end. Sean O'Malley Cuck. Former UFC bantamweight champion and certified UFC star Sean O'Malley grew up before our very eyes as MMA fans. We saw him as that kid who entered the UFC in spectacular fashion, proclaiming the Sugar Show.
Welcome to the Sugar Show!
And then see him become a husband and a father. But I don't think the MMA community will ever let him live down the fact that he has a less than scandalous lifestyle that he lived during his 20s, known as a man to sleep around. He extended that same courtesy to his longtime partner and mother of his children. Not that she really wanted it, I guess, as she always seemed like she wanted to be a loyal partner, but that didn't stop Sean trying to set up his missus with his friend.
He might as well have, pimped her out, basically, when he mentioned that they're in an open relationship and any guy can have his wife and he won't mind. There's literally a podcast. You guys can find this clip, I'm sure.
We're in an open relationship. And I don't even want to call it that. I don't want to call it any label.
Has she ever told you she smashed another guy and then you guys dabbed each other up?
She hasn't smashed any biscuits before, but she told me one time, I want to have sex with someone. And you know him. Like, it was one of my buddies.
You know him.
And so I said, who is it? And she told me. I swear to God, I messaged that kid. And I said, you know what kind of relationship we're in. I'm not going to be mad at you. If it happened, if she hits you up, you have my word.
Tim's girl and O'Malley's girl went out on a night out together on a weekend. Smithy was saying that he was there in the house when O'Malley and Tim Welch, who are so okay with the open relationship, were pacing around the kitchen, worried about what their girls were getting up to when they were out because of the agreement that they've done with their relationship.
Paddy throwing up blood. Paddy won his Cage Warriors title back in 2016 as a featherweight, and less than 2 months later, he would find himself back in the cage taking on UFC vet Julian Erosa, defending his throne for the first time as a featherweight champion. In a 5-round war that many people felt could have gone either way, Paddy would be declared the victor, but it was during his post-fight interview in the center of the cage that the Scouser would vomit down upon the canvas and his belt in what looked like blood-soaked vomit. Paddy would later clarify that it wasn't in fact blood.
Paddy Pimblett puked blood. Wasn't blood. I just didn't listen to anyone at the time and drank a hot chocolate and Ferrero Rocher on the way to the venue.
Yuri isolation. Yuri has quickly become a fan favorite, not just because of his electric fighting style, but mostly because of his high-functioning autism. From swordplay to antihistamine therapy to, perhaps most ludicrously, his self-imposed isolation in the dark after his win over Rakic at UFC 300. According to Yuri, he learnt a lot about himself in the darkness.
3.5 days, just you, just water, training, spend the time with your best ideas, go through your fear.
How do you train?
Shadow boxing, breathing technique, visualize.
It's so incredible.
Ultimately, it would do little to affect his performance in the next outing. Tattoo bite mark. In the previous version of this Iceberg, we discussed some biting techniques used in the Tough House when Cannibal Cheney took a chunk out of a tough fighter. Little did I know that another biting situation would unfold in the octagon a little later. At Fight Night Rebus vs Namajunas, Igor Severino bit his opponent Andrew Lima on the bicep as they clenched alongside the cage in the second round of their flyweight bout. The ref stepped in and stopped the fight, and reviewing the situation, he would call an end to the bout, declaring it a disqualification due to biting. Dana White put his money where his mouth is, declaring that Lima would get the first ever bite of the night bonus and a cool 25 grand to go along with it. Lima, who was making his UFC debut, was beside himself and decided to immortalize probably one of the best days of his life when he got the bite mark tattooed on himself that very night in the Las Vegas Strip. After Dana White saw what he had done, he would actually offer up a further 25k bonus because he said it was so awesome. Lima has since gone on to put a further 3 wins together, and Severino has been booted from the organization for life. Henry Cejudo burglary. Just 2 months ago, the King of Cringe would post a weird video that looks like it was filmed by himself, but set up to look like it was an actual news crew interviewing him after he stopped a hit-and-run driver outside of his house. But in doing so, Henry broadcasted to the whole world where he lives. And so just 2 days later, the front of his house, which acts as his studio, was broken into, and once the thieves were inside, they stole up to 10k in camera equipment and cash, and Henry's very first UFC belt.
So because we had so much media attention around our neighborhood, somebody comes into my studio, breaks into my studio, and pretty much steals my camera and steals my belt, dude.
Which, to be honest, is pretty devastating, considering that he had even lost his Olympic medal in a wildfire back in California some time ago. I do think it's very unfortunate that he lost these 2 incredible moments in time. Apparently the UFC are going to sort him out with a new belt to replace it, which is going to be a bit difficult considering that the UFC belt has changed its appearance now. And I guess Henry learned a valuable lesson: never showcase where you live on TV. Dana White bail money. In the very first edition of this Iceberg, we discussed how Kane was placed in jail for attempted murder. Well, after some time fighting in court, he has since been released from jail on bond, and Dana White was actually the man that put up the rather pricey bail amount of $1 million.
And also, he did pay my bail as well.
Oh wow!
So they're helping.
Which is an extremely great gesture to a fighter who sacrificed a lot of blood for this organization and was indeed one of the best heavyweights of that generation. Kane has since been convicted. His time already spent in jail and under house arrest after being bailed out were counted towards his sentence of 5 years in jail. I just effed your ass. UFC 18 lives deep in the annals of UFC history, back when things were a little looser, and certain sponsorships slipped through the net. Things like Condom Depot and Dick Pill sponsors, 2 things that John Jones needs if he is in an all-male nightclub. Anyway, Tito Ortiz, the former light heavyweight world champion, probably has the strangest sponsor of all, and this was at UFC 18. I'll read out a little excerpt from his autobiography, which is fantastic if you ask me. That was the night I earned my reputation as the Huntington Beach bad boy. Back in my junior college days, when I beat an opponent, I would pretend my fingers were guns, fire them and then blow on the barrels. It was a showboating thing for sure. That's what I did that night, but I wasn't finished with my act. Shortly before the fight, I was approached by this porno production company called Extreme Associates. They said, "We'll pitch you a couple grand if you wear this t-shirt after the fight." The t-shirt said, "I just effed your ass." I said, "Cool, I'll do it." And my reputation was cemented. The Huntington Beach bad boy. Bryce Mitchell's power drill incident. Speaking of effing your ass, our favorite Arkansas native almost got John Jonesed by a power drill whilst working on his farm back in 2018. Against all health and safety brochures, whilst using an unspecified power tool that he had positioned firmly between his legs doing some home improvements, he lost control, and the thing, according to Bryce Mitchell, almost tore his nutsack in half. I was holding a board over my head with a drill in my pants. I was sizing up the board and the drill went off. Luckily, his nut survived another day, and he would enter the octagon shortly again after. Bryce Hitler. Earlier this year, Bryce Mitchell got himself into hot water after the Flat Earther proclaimed that Hitler, the man responsible for killing many millions of people, not including, by the way, an ethnic cleansing, might just be a nice guy that he could have gone fishing with. It's quite the proclamation, but considering this guy's anti-seatbelts amongst other ludicrous things, it's nothing out of the ordinary for the Arkansas native. After Bryce's comments, Dana White was essentially forced to come out and denounce the featherweight employee.
We've obviously reached out to Bryce when we read what he said and let him know how we feel about it. We're beyond disgusted.
45-70. Back at the UFC 299 ceremonial weigh-ins, Michael Venom Page would do his signature move to taunt Kevin Holland, and in response, Holland grabbed Page's hand, creating a bizarre but funny moment between the competitors. Most of us let the awkwardness pass over, except Rampage Jackson. At the sight of the two men embracing physically, he was inspired to write a comment on Instagram saying how it reminded him of two lesbians. Kevin wasn't at all happy with what was being said though, and during his time on the Jackson podcast, essentially unloaded his anger on Rampage. Things became heated immediately, escalating to the point Holland point blank told Jackson to shut up. You can see the clip here for what was being said.
Do you know what a 45-70 is?
I'm just telling.
Do you know what a 45-70 is?
I'm just telling.
It's not a 45-70 that we're shooting across the room trying to see who hits the target. I'm not worried about it. 45-70 is?
No, I don't.
Okay then. Shut the fuck up.
The incident lost Kevin Holland a lot of fans who felt that he was just being petty and childish. Jim Miller tick bite. Jim Miller is the record holder for the most fights in the UFC history at 46, and notably fighting on UFC 100, 200, and 300. It's crazy to see Miller still putting on great performances this long into his MMA career. He is the embodiment of a true UFC veteran. But Jim's trials weren't just in the octagon. Back in 2015, Jim would begin to experience neuropathy and extreme brain fog, walking into a room and feeling lost. It seemed as though there was something really wrong with Miller that he couldn't put a finger on, as he began to forget words and was almost unable to train for his upcoming fight at UFC 196, but his doctor was convinced his sickness was from a potential tick bite and ran tests for the parasite lurking in his body. Lyme disease is a bacterial infection transmitted to humans through the bite of infected ticks. Miller would go on the Joe Rogan podcast and tell the story of how he believed that he was bitten in early 2013, 2 whole years before he was able to figure out what was causing his sickness.
Tell me about this Lyme disease thing, man, because I'm terrified of Lyme disease.
Like it got so bad that I was contemplating retirement at UFC 200. I was like, I'm gonna get through 196. I'm gonna ask to fight on 200 to retire.
Did not know you had Lyme.
Did not know I had Lyme disease. Joints were swollen. I'd get some twitching in my eye. Was mostly where I'd get it. It was just for like days on end. Very occasionally, I would say the wrong word while I was speaking, and not even anything close, like just the complete wrong word would come out.
It's crazy to think that he was still competing and winning during those 2 years. He has since sought treatment and got better. Fight Circus. Out of all the fight promotions that I've ever stumbled upon, Fight Circus might just be one of the strangest that I have ever seen. Fight Circus is a unique combat sports promotion known for its unconventional and entertaining events, blending real and theatrical elements. Based in Thailand and organized by Full Metal Dojo, it hosts a variety of bizarre and creative fight formats that deviate from traditional mixed martial arts. The promotion aims to deliver a mind-bending, sense-scrambling spectacle, often featuring high-energy, humorous and absurd matchups that prioritize entertainment. From the ultimate dick-kicking competition to coin flip striking battles and phone booth Muay Thai, it all caters to fans seeking a wild, unpredictable spectacle. Whilst its legitimacy is sometimes questioned, Fight Circus has carved out a niche as a humorous alternative to mainstream MMA, delivering memorable and often hilarious events. Napoleon Bonaparte, our brother in arms on this channel, has also had the honor of doing a little bit of commentating for the organization.
Fight Circus 6 also featured me doing voice work. Not to brag or anything, but I'm kind of a big deal in the clown world MMA sphere.
Shout out to our homie Napoleon. Nina Drama. Nina Drama burst onto the A scene with her jaw-dropping social media content. I mean, wait, how the f did she burst onto the UFC scene? Wait, how does she have access to exclusive interviews with pay-per-view leads? If this isn't an industry plant, I don't know what is. Did you also know that Nina, before her prestigious MMA content creator career, was a Playboy bunny? And so, when you really start to connect the dots on how this lady got her gigs, it might just make all a bit more sense as to why Nina Drama is a leading figure in the content creation scene on the MMA space. Arman's injury. Talking of Nina and her exclusive access, right before UFC 311, where Islam Makhachev was scheduled to defend his belt against Arman Tsarukyan, the challenger would pull out of the fight citing a back injury. It was a rather disappointing time for MMA fans, as many believe Tsarukyan posed the greatest threat to Islam's throne, and I guess it's a question we'll never get an answer to, as Islam has since abandoned the division. Anyway, back to the bad back. Well, people were quick to point out that a cheeky little interview that Arman did with ours truly Nina Drama, in which he shows a very different type of back strengthening exercise. It's hard not to put 1 and 2 together and come to the conclusion that this back exercise might indeed not be good for one's back. Anyway, we hope to see Arman back in the title picture soon. Welcome to Tier 3. This is where things get far more obscure. This layer will test how much of a fan of this sport you really are. Dave Bautista. Way back before Bautista pile-drived Ryan Gosling through a drywall in a dystopian 2049 Los Angeles at the height of his acting career, Dave was a 6-time WWE World Champion, but he left the company in 2010 saying that he didn't like the direction the company was going in. In the fallout of his WWE career, and being utterly broke, he wanted to pursue other career paths, and so he saw an avenue to wealth through real violence. This is what he had to say about that time in his life.
I want to be a legitimate fighter. I didn't like the direction that professional wrestling was going in.
He ventured into MMA for a single professional fight in 2012, fighting in the CES MMA organization. Originally, he was tied to a bout with Rashad Evans, but due to a probation violation, it was later changed to Vince Lucero, who had a record of 22 wins and 22 losses, and had fought the likes of Roy Nelson and Travis Fulton. The fight itself was underwhelming. Bautista seemed like a deer caught in headlights, taking a flurry of punches and looked completely shocked that he was actually getting punched in the face. Once his nerves had settled by the middle of the round, he shot a double leg takedown and successfully established top position, ending the fight by strikes that rained down upon his flattened out opponent. Bautista would go on to become an Ozempic overlord and an actor, of course. Bully Beatdown. Bully Beatdown is an American reality TV series that aired on MTV from 2009 to 2011, created by Mark Burnett. The show centers on real-life bullies who are challenged to fight professional mixed martial artists in a cage match for a chance to win up to $10,000, hosted by the rather psychotic Jason Mayhem Miller.
This is me! I'm a 6'1" Capricorn who likes long walks on the beach and books about Europe.
A professional fighter known for his wacky humor and infectious energy. The show centers on a bit of melodrama, the confrontation of bullies, and a bit of physical combat in the form of MMA that delivers a unique form of justice for bullying victims. Each episode follows a structured format where victims nominate their bullies, who are then pitted against skilled MMA fighters, often resulting in the bullies getting the shit beat out of them by the likes of top-billed MMA fighters such as Tyron Woodley, Michelle Waterson, and Eddie Alvarez. The show often begins with Miller presenting a video where victims describe their experience with a bully. He then meets the victims in person to discuss their situation before confronting the bully, offering them $10,000 to fight a professional MMA fighter. The fight consists of 2 rounds. The first focuses on grappling, and the second on kickboxing. Bullies start each round with $5,000, but they lose money if they tap out, get knocked out, or if the referee stops the fight. It's rare for a bully to ever walk away with any money, and the whole point is that they basically get their ass handed to them. Checking out Ronda. Joe Rogan was Ronda's biggest glazer during her heyday, to the point he confidently thought she could beat male bantamweights in her prime, and even Floyd Mayweather in a boxing fight. However, that narrative came crashing down when Holly Holm head-kicked her onto the stage of the Ellen DeGeneres show crying.
I was like, she could probably beat half the men bantamweights in the UFC.
Is that true?
No, it's not. Definitely not true.
Anyway, naturally, Joe Rogan used to have a crush on her, and he was actively caught checking her out on camera during the weigh-ins for UFC 168. Joe can be seen blushing and seemingly acknowledging to someone that he is on camera staring at her undress. Oscar Willis Mac Life. Oscar Willis is the host of the Mac Life, Conor McGregor's media brand, one of the more likable media members that attends the UFC press conferences and actually asks questions that get the fighters talking. What sets him apart from the rest of the media is that he has created relationships with some of the fighters, notably doing pub talk with Dan Hooker, where they get drunk and banter post-UFC events. Oscar also has fought inside of the MMA cage and won a decision in a genuinely exciting pro fight against Jeremiah Benavidez, something most media members would never dare do. This fight gained him a lot of respect in the MMA community, but he didn't stop there. His next bout would be in BKFC, and none other than Dan Hooker would be in his corner, stepping into the squared circle barefisted and throwing down for 3 hard rounds. Takes 2 balls the size of Dana White's giant bald head, and he earned everyone's respect for that, stopping his opponent in the first round via TKO. Oscar is always paving a path forward in the MMA media space, and I think him and the Mac Life team are very valued. Effing amateur. Chael Sonnen might just be the hero of the MMA community. Endless viral callouts. The man is simply a legend of the sport, but perhaps his most popular of all of his incidents is the rather infamous "I can't let you get close" confrontation with Brazilian axe murderer Vanderlei Silva. It took place on the set of The Ultimate Fighter Season 3, Brazil. Silva decided to confront Sonnen over him talking shit, screaming, "Wanna now?"
Wanna know. Please stop.
And rather than make an awesome soundbite or a viral confrontational clip, thought it would be a better idea to get physical, at which point Sonnen said the meme-to-death line of, "I can't let you get close."
I can't let you get close.
After a little bit of distance control and eyeing up, Chael would dive in for a takedown, and as he did so, uttered the line, "fucking amateur," which is something that I had never noticed until it was brought to my attention recently. Chael could be referring to 2 different things here. Either Silva is an amateur at wrestling and got taken down easily like CM Punk, or he is an amateur for making a potentially viral clip into a physical one, something that would ultimately bring an end to both of their times on the show. I think it's pretty funny that Chael would say something like this whilst taking down a man in a literal physical dust-up. Spray tan sponsor. Sam Alvey is a man known for the longest winless streak in the UFC, and he has always been a rather quirky, rather likeable man, and despite his losing ways, was always a bit of a laugh inside of the cage. Well, in 2015, Sam would push the boundaries of advertising inside of the cage by getting the sponsor of his fight spray tanned onto his chest. #perfect tan. It was rather tastefully plonked on his pecs, much to the dismay of UFC officials who completely lost their minds after finding out shortly before the walkout. The enraged top dogs, who scrambled to get it off of his chest but ultimately couldn't, eventually fined Sam $50,000. Maybe he would have gotten away with it if he had Reebok fake tanned onto his body instead, or Crypto.com. Either way, Sam apparently learned his lesson. In the fight in question though, Sam would ultimately knock out his opponent Dan Kelly in just 50 seconds, which is a pretty fantastic performance if you ask me. Sam, after exiting the UFC, has gone on to become a karate combat heavyweight world champion and defended that title multiple times, and so it's nice to see him do well for himself since leaving the organization. Pride prank. Mauro Ranallo might just be one of the most iconic voices of all of MMA, up there with Goldberg, Rogan, and insert token American former professional fighter here. Moreau defined many of Pride's greatest fights with his infectious energy, but perhaps one of the funniest videos that I have seen from the man is when Bas Rutten set up a rather formidable crow cop to intimidate the commentator. It's quite in keeping with Bas to be pranking people this way, to be honest.
You was a commentator on my last fight, right?
That's right.
Against Nogueira, right?
No, that wasn't me. I was a commentator against Dos Caras.
I don't know which show it is, but I just didn't like your sound, okay? Because
right.
I heard Miss Bas, I heard you,
right.
I heard your voice. I don't want to speak anymore. Is it you understand it?
Oh, very much. I understand, sir. So thank you.
Yeah. Did I tell you something?
Yes.
Please,
Come here. Yeah, I will. Okay, thank you.
Right
Sorry,
now.
Mirko.
Leave it right now.
I apologize.
Man, this is just a joke.
Oh.
It's Pat's game. It's my idea.
The Fighting Business. The Fighting Business is one of the best YouTube MMA channels out there. The creator and his editor work extremely hard in creating detailed, well thought out and creative pieces almost every single week, giving fans great insights to not only upcoming fights, but chronicling earlier big moments in the UFC. They had made, from what I could remember, hundreds of videos, many garnering well over millions of views, and well-earned views at that. Well, unfortunately, earlier this year, they were copyright striked by an MMA media organization for improperly using their copyrighted footage. Naturally, there was a lot of backlash, as the Fighting Business panicked and deleted all of his previous content to avoid getting a third and final strike and having his channel removed from existence forever. It's a massive shame to see all of his hard work and viral videos snuffed out from existence, and I truly feel bad for the guy. The Fighting Business has since gone on to start posting once more, rebuilding his catalogue of content, and is doing quite well for himself, but it really is a shame to see what had happened to his channel. But such is this game that we play on YouTube. I highly recommend going checking out his videos as they are so great. He certainly is a great asset to this community. MMA Guru bonuses. There is no doubt that fighter pay has been an extremely controversial subject over the years. The big dogs in the organization want more money, millions more that is, and the little first-time contract guys, well, they just want to be a professional and still put food on the table for their kids. And whilst Dana White acts like this is a side hustle or an opportunity, you know, the kind of side hustle or opportunity where it involves working out twice a day, recovering, learning, nutrition, putting your body on the line, weight cuts, you know, that kind of side hustle. These men doing that grind are getting paid 10k to show, 10k to win, whilst the company makes record profits in the billions. MMA media has been pretty outspoken about it, but not really ever to the brass's face. MMA YouTube, on the other hand, are more than vocal about it. And you know, it's okay if we sit here and rant in our basements or shed and say some untasteful things about the UFC and their fighter treatment. They can't block us from access to shows in order to do our job, unlike the reporters, so I can see why they're a bit more reserved than MMA YouTubers. Well, MMA Guru took it on his rather broad shoulders, and earlier last year decided that he would implement a new bonus system for first-time contracted fighters in order to help them out a little bit. I'll let him explain a little.
In 2025, I'm putting up my own money to pay out fighters on UFC cards that do well, that deserve a bit of extra money, and are on their first contract in the UFC. Now,
anyway, very little has come of this, many in the comments asking Little Piggy when he is going to cough up his hard-earned money. Anyway, it was a good idea in kind of chucking it out there, but it makes little sense for Guru himself to front the bill, and so whilst I guess we all appreciate his attempt to shine a light on this subject, it just seems like not enough people actually care, and MMA managers and MMA promoters will always, and have always, screwed with their fighters. Good job this whole thing isn't a monopoly, right? Right? Dana White $250,000 gift. On the subject of Dana White and fighter pay, for one of the Nelt Boys' birthdays, the UFC president would gift a cool $250,000 as a thank you for not only their friendship, but also the hard work the boys do in promoting the UFC and Power Slap, from getting fighters on their viral podcast to vlogging around the company's different endeavors. Which, you know, is fair enough. I guess they don't have to do this type of thing for the UFC or Power Slap, so I guess it's money well earned. But others, notably former UFC athletes, analysts and media, suggested it would have been more appropriate to give all that sweet, sweet cash to, you know, MMA fighters who risk brain trauma to make this sport, and by extension the UFC, a success. Former UFC title contender Dan Hardy said, "Retweet this if you think Uncle Dana should give all of UFC's top 15 ranked fighters $250,000 for their next birthday." American MMA fighter Alan Jouban, who last competed in the UFC in 2020, tweeted, "I think everyone involved in the UFC would love a surprise 250 grand, but what Dana does with his personal money is up to him." But all of that is probably propaganda from Alan Jouban, because he basically still works for the UFC as an analyst. Dana, however, had some choice words for people talking shit about his choices that he makes with his own money. And the one thing I'll say about this type of thing of gifting money,
You don't like the way we pay our fighters?
we can talk until we're blue in the face about UFC base pay for sure, but one thing you can't talk shit about with regards to Dana and his money and his personal handouts is that there are billions of examples of fighters who have had money gifted to them behind the scenes by Dana personally, whether it was for performances, for health issues or family issues or charity, whatever it is, Dana is constantly reaching into his personal pocket and handing out wads of cash. One example that always springs to mind is Michael Bisping getting a surprise bonus.
I walk into a room and they just say, "Hey Mike, that was amazing. That was awesome." And they hand me an envelope. And I take it, I open it, and it was a check for $80,000.
Jason Solomon. A viral video burst onto the scene about 9 or 10 years ago of an American fighter known as Jason Solomon making one of the most ridiculous, obnoxious, and showboaty walkouts known to man, dangling off the cage like an absolute degen. But it didn't go down so well for the 3-0 undefeated fighter at the time, as 9 seconds into the fight, he would find peace and tranquility in the bleak darkness of the sunless realm, knocked out cold and relegated for the first time to the losing column, and most importantly, the dark world of memes. Jason last fought around 2 years ago, and has now accumulated a record of 9-4, at least he is trying, I guess. Ali Helbati. Speaking of the more obnoxious MMA fighters out there, Ali Helbati, an Iranian fighter who was competing for the promotion HFC, decided that he would boot a ring girl just doing her job right in the arse. She turned around, dismayed, and the ref stepped in to have a go at the fighter for being so disrespectful. Well, after losing the fight shortly afterward, the Iranian fighter would receive a lifetime ban from the promotion and is yet to ever compete in the sport of MMA again, probably because, on top of all of that, he is 0-3 as an MMA fighter, 3 rounds and 1/10. Cage Warriors is probably the best organisation coming out of the UK, providing the UFC with many top-ranked future fighters and even many future champions. Some of the fights that they have put on have been pretty remarkable, and it's always a great idea to tune in on UFC Fight Pass when you can. Well, this cheeky little entry comes from a fight that took place at Cage Warriors 197, where Keir Harvey took on Alejandros Montiz, or however you pronounce that last name. The men battled it out in a fairly grueling 3-round affair, but as the fight came down to the last 10 seconds, nothing really happened. The clacker didn't go, the horn didn't sound, it just went silent and the clock stopped on the bottom of the screen, and then the men continued to smack the shit out of each other, the ref watching on in blissful glee. In the background, you could see people rushing around the cage, presumably trying to get the cage-side officials to actually blow the horn. Well, it took all of about 30 seconds for the fight to actually end after it was meant to, thus creating the one and only 3 rounds and 1/10 fight. Conor McGregor wants to run for Irish president. I mean, let's ask Napoleon Bonaparte's opinion on this, shall we?
I've been asked multiple times recently what I think of Conor's run for president. I'd just like to take a few minutes to take a gigantic shit on those notions and explain exactly why, once and for all, this will never happen. Sky News polled 134 of our politicians to see who exactly would be willing to nominate Conor for president, and I'd just like to read a few of the responses here. He's a misogynist and a thug. On behalf of the women of Ireland, he can f*** off.
Slap that little nose off him, yeah?
I consider him to be a tacky, moronic vulgarian. I would never consider him even remotely a suitable person for a nomination.
Where the f*** everyone?
Laura Sanko kiss. Laura Sanko may be lusted over by the weebs of the MMA community, but for all those who think it's just sweaty fat men who want a piece of the UFC commentator, you'd be dead wrong. Tonya Evinger, at the time, in 2016, was Invicta's 135-pound champion, and in her first successful defense of the title, she would take the opportunity to kiss Laura Sanko right on the lips in her post-fight interview, and I think Laura leaned into it a little bit. Johnny Walker post-fight. Right after Johnny Walker's emphatic win over Ion Cutelaba, he was deported from the stadium along with his coach, shoeless, still in his fighting shorts. There was some confusion on the UFC side as to what actually happened. Dana White tried to deny that he was just chucked out, but it sure looks like it from where I'm sitting. James Lynch would actually talk to him after the fact, where Johnny explained it a little bit more.
And I'm sure you wanted to celebrate after the win, but I saw the UFC, for whatever reason, didn't let you stick around after the fight with you and your coach, John Kavanagh. What happened there? Why weren't you allowed to stay in the arena?
I have no idea. I still don't know much about what happened. They said that I needed tickets, but I kind of understand because if I come back to the arena, I can't sit nowhere because I don't have the tickets, don't have like seats. I could stay inside, like all of the staff was inside and everybody have of course 100% have a place to stay inside. The girl just don't let me come back inside. I just want to watch the fights, you know, for any screen that was going through, but they just bring me back to the hotel.
Chael Sonnen's fake UFC belt. In January 2012, Chael Sonnen's antics at UFC on Fox 2 press conference in Chicago turned heads, but not for the right reasons. Once celebrated for his sharp-witted trash talk, Sonnen's performance at the pre-fight presser was met with a bit of resistance by fans who felt like Chael was playing a parody of himself. He brought a replica UFC championship belt, proclaiming himself the true middleweight champion. It even confused Dana, who was convinced that the belt was real.
That's what I was just checking. I didn't even see that when I came out.
What is that sitting in front of you, and when did you win that? Well, for those of you that can't see, this is the World Championship title, of which I took from Anderson Silva.
And Chael even did a little bit of rapping, spitting rhymes about his biggest arms and his greatest charm.
You're looking at the reflection of perfection, the one that gets all your attention. You're looking at the man with the biggest arms, the man with the greatest charm, and the man in Chicago to do a lot of harm to a guy 3 doors down.
These theatrics meant to hype up his fight against Michael Bisping fell a little bit flat at the time. His over-the-top style, likened to pro wrestling, alienated some fans who craved authenticity. The thing is, whilst this is how people felt about it at the time, I kinda look back at this moment with a lot of happiness because it's just a fucking hilarious moment and I don't know why people had such a problem with it. Fighter fakes heart attack. In perhaps one of the most bizarre fights that I've ever witnessed, the heavily tattooed and heavy diabetic Jonathan Ivey would take on Travis Fulton in a super heavyweight fight with all the trimmings. Ivey would eat a kick to his liver, then faking a liver shot, or as it was widely reported at the time, a heart attack, lured in Fulton, at which point he released a deadly combination at 0.25 speed that floored his opponent. After roughing him up on the canvas for a good minute or so, Ivey, the man clearly winning the fight, just randomly tapped out and lost the fight. Many people believe that it was a little bit of a setup, as Fulton has a rather suspicious record as it is.
I was the heavyweight champion in that organization. The fight was over. Did I want to win? Yes. I didn't want to lose my title. Hell. But I tapped because the fight was over, Mike.
Ivey would go on to fight one more time, losing that one and extending his record to 41 wins and 57 losses. Jesus Christ. AI insults. In a, inverted commas, groundbreaking move for MMA, Corey Sandhagen utilized artificial intelligence to craft trash talk for his opponent Davidson Figueiredo ahead of their main event 5-rounder taking place on May 3rd, 2025. Known more for his technical prowess and violent mentality than his verbal skills, Sandhagen turned to ChatGPT to generate pre-fight insults. One line was, "Figueiredo fights like a guy who knows his prime ended the night Moreno took his soul," referencing Figueiredo's losses to Brandon Moreno. Another jab was, "His ego's still in the title picture, but his skills are stuck in the prelims." Sandhagen shared these AI-generated remarks on his YouTube channel, embracing technology to enhance fight promotion in the most cringy way possible, I guess.
He walks around like he's still champ, but every fight lately looks like a retirement audition.
He secured a TKO victory over Figueiredo in the second round. GFL AI. AI is obviously changing the way humans interact with technology, and the rate that it is progressing means that very, very soon, it will be indistinguishable from work that is human hands to that is the binary hands, whether it's videos, scripts, or, well, like we discussed, insults against a UFC fighter. It is quite literally taking over. One place that it wasn't so well implemented was for the reveal of what I can only assume is the failed fight promotion GFL, who decided to pick up every single wash fighter the world has ever known and pitch them against each other, almost like a retirement home for those with CTE. Well, when they decided to showcase their roster, some absolute brain melt thought that it would be an outstanding idea to do so using AI and putting all the fighters in some kind of like spaceman suit or Superman costume or something. I don't really know what the point was, but it certainly looks horrendous and has since been memed to death. I just feel sorry for the fighters that had to be revealed to the world looking like some strange extraterrestrials. The icing on the cake is that none of the fighters announced have actually competed in the organization, and I doubt that they ever will. The Titan of MMA. Hongman Choi, known as the Techno Goliath, is a South Korean fighter whose extraordinary size, 7'2" and approximately 350 pounds, made him a legendary figure in mixed martial arts and kickboxing, emerging during MMA's formative years in the mid-2000s when freak show fights captivated audiences. Choi's physical presence often overshadowed his technical abilities because, he's literally a fucking giant. Choi's MMA journey began in 2006 with a stunning 16-second knockout. He then competed in Japan's Dream organization, facing elite fighters like Mirko Krokop, who defeated him via TKO. His most publicized bout came back in 2009 at Dream Super Hulk tournament, where he dispatched retired baseball player Jose Canseco in just 1 minute and 17 seconds. Choi's legacy, however, rises above his win-loss record. Labeled as a freak show fighter, he embodied MMA's early era, where physical anomalies drew crowds. His fights, though sometimes gimmicky, contributed to the sport's rapid growth. People wanted to see the strangest of the strange matchups. They wanted blood to flow, and for it to be at the expense of a giant or a sumo wrestler, or a guy with one boxing glove on. The sacrifice people like Choi made is what grew this sport into the very thing that we love today. Choi's participation in high-profile events like K1 and Dream, particularly in Japan, made him an icon of the sport, and even if you don't know his name, you certainly know the face. Whilst Choi no longer competes, his story remains chiseled into the history books, and whilst dust coats VHS tapes of his highlights on Pride or K1, his place in the sport will never be forgotten. Gracie vs. Tadeo Riot. On September 27, 1997, at Pentagon Combat in Rio de Janeiro, Renzo Gracie faced Eugene Tadeo in a fight that pitted Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Luta Livre against one another, a culmination of sorts of an intense rivalry between the two sports that had been waging for decades at this point in the country. BJJ, championed by the Gracie family, emphasized ground-based submission grappling, often associated with Brazil's elite. Luta Livre, on the other hand, was a freestyle wrestling-based discipline and was seen as a martial arts for the working class, led by figures like Marco Ruas. By the late 1980s, tensions escalated as BJJ gained international prominence, partly due to the Gracie family's efforts in the US. The 1997 Pentagon Combat event was the stage for this rivalry to physically manifest in bloodshed. Renzo quickly took Tadeo down, passed his guard and secured a dominant mount position, coming close to finishing the fight with submissions and strikes. Renzo later claimed he struggled due to oil on Tadeo's body, which made grappling difficult, combined with the slippery vinyl floor of the fighting area. As Renzo tired after about 15 minutes, Tadeo began to reverse the momentum, gaining control and landing effective strikes. This shift energized the Luta Livre supporters in the crowd. The tipping point came when Renzo, frustrated by a fan's taunts, punched the spectator. This act ignited a massive brawl involving approximately 400 people, with chairs thrown, a fire breaking out, lights going out, and unconfirmed reports of a stabbing. The riot, broadcasted on national television, forced the fight's cancellation, resulting in a no-contest ruling. The violence prompted authorities to ban MMA events in Rio de Janeiro for nearly a decade. It was a crazy time for the sport, and shows how, whilst the Gracies are hailed as pseudo-gods in the MMA space, the reality is in Brazil is that those on the lower end of the totem pole of socio-economics kind of despise the Gracies. Sarukian punches fan. During his walkout to fight Charles Oliveira at UFC 300, Sarukian reacted impulsively to a fan's taunts by punching the mouthy shitbag. This moment was caught live on the UFC broadcast, although later reports suggest that the punch actually missed. The UFC went under damage control immediately and asked politely for the fan not to sue, and I believe he ended up actually getting free tickets for promising not to sue the company. The Nevada State Athletic Commission, who are a bunch of shits, responded in their usual greedy way, imposing a fine of $25,000 and a 9-month suspension on Sarukian for his actions. This suspension could have been reduced to 6 months if he completed an anti-bullying public service announcement, but Arman ain't no sissy bitch, and declined. Plus, the ban is only in Las Vegas, so I guess he didn't give much of a shit anyway. Sarukian has gone on to royally mess up his own career anyway.
Around 1 a.m., we received a call from Arman Sarukian, who informed us that he was experiencing significant back pain due to the injury. He feels like he is not healthy enough to compete, so he is out of the fight. Stepping in to face Islam Makhachev for the title will be Renato Moicano.
Tra Teligman. In the previous Iceberg, we discussed the one-armed fighter. Well, in this one, I present another fighter who braves the world of violence with physical limitations. His name is Tra Teligman, a man who had fought in the UFC with one lung and one pec, and despite his physical setback, he had actually managed to finish his long-lasting veteran MMA career by going 7 wins, 5 losses, 1 no contest, perhaps best known for getting in the semi-finals of UFC 12 heavyweight tournament, losing to a juice to the gills Vitor Belfort. Tra would ultimately face many of the best of that era, from the likes of Tim Silva to Pedro Rizzo, and in fact, most of his losses were actually against UFC world champions or world title challengers, which if you ask me, is extremely impressive. Tra retired in 2005. Tony Ferguson DUI. On May 7th, 2023, Ferguson was arrested in Hollywood, California for suspected DUI after his Chevrolet Silverado crashed into parked cars outside a nightclub around 2 a.m, flipping onto its side. No injuries were reported, but police noted that Ferguson smelled of alcohol, had bloodshot eyes and was uncooperative, refusing a field sobriety test. In November 2023, the misdemeanor DUI charge was dismissed. Ferguson pleaded no contest to reckless driving, receiving 1 year of probation with conditions, including no alcohol consumption whilst driving and paying restitution. The incident, coupled with Ferguson's losing streak, just added fuel to the fire. It was really a hard time for many fans to witness the UFC's boogeyman have such a massive fall from grace. Welcome to Tier 4, the first taste of what the dirty depths of this sport can offer. Things become conspiratorial, darker, and more disturbing. The appetizer for the grim and clandestine Tiers 5 and 6. Shout out to the puppy. In the very first Iceberg video, which got age restricted, and only OGs will remember, as I think I had less than 1,000 subscribers at the time, in that video we talked about one of the things that got that very video restricted. That was Israel doing a rather inappropriate thing to his dog. Anyway, years passed, and a certain now famous MMA YouTuber, Mr. MMA Guru himself, exposed this whole thing for the first time to a wider audience. But like me and most OGs trolling through Reddit as MMA fans at the time, knew that this footage of Israel doing that thing to his dog had existed for years before MMA Guru got his chubby little fingers onto it. Anyway, Guru didn't stop there, and he ended up covering Israel's alleged obsession with furries also. Whilst I don't buy into any of this shit, and yes, Israel is a bit of a weird bloke, but I think that we are kidding ourselves if we honestly think that he is out here being sexually attracted to dogs and girls dressed up as dogs. But the reason that this is on the iceberg is because MMA Guru's coverage of this actually leaked its way into the world of fighting itself. Somehow, Sean Strickland caught wind of Guru's video and took it on himself to personally attack Israel about it all fight week long, creating some of the most viral trash talk lines out there.
When I post a video of me f***ing off my f***ing dog, they will put some credibility to that. F***ing puppy man. I had to double check that shit just to make sure it was legit, and it was legit.
And this stuff very clearly affected Israel mentally, to the point that when Israel lost the fight against Sean, it was the first thing that he asked Sean not to bring up in the Octagon interview, saying, "Don't talk about my family," pointing to the dog tattoo on his neck, the dog that he allegedly did those things to. So although it's several degrees removed, MMA Guru directly affected the momentum of a fight. Israel didn't fight like he normally would, and most have chalked that up to the pre-fight build-up, which wouldn't have been the same without Guru's videos. Matt Riddell. Matt Riddell's journey through combat sports and professional wrestling is a confusing tale to say the least. Matt Riddell entered the UFC in 2008, gaining traction through The Ultimate Fighter Season 7, where he entered the tough house as a professional athlete with literally 0 wins. He would win his first fight, but then lose in the quarterfinals. He would, however, be offered a chance to come back and fight in the live season of the final. From there, Matt would put together an impressive record of 8 wins, 3 losses, and 2 no contests. The 2 no contests being the crux of this story, which we'll get into in a second. He was ranked 3rd in the UFC for takedown defense, sitting at 89.3%, and 8th for total strikes landed, 1,350, showcasing just how good this UFC vet truly was. However, his career was derailed by drug test failures. In October 2012, following UFC 149, he tested positive for marijuana, resulting in his win over Chris Clements being changed to a no contest. He was also hit with a 90-day suspension and a fine. Another positive test in February 2013 led to a rather stinging lecture from the UFC president.
Now, the reason he's not in the UFC anymore is because he could not pass a drug test. The guy couldn't pass a drug test.
Who then fully turned on Matt Riddell and subsequently released him from the company. It was a massive controversy at the time, and a crying shame, to be honest. It was just weak leadership from the UFC to punish Matt Riddell so stupidly, but Matt would end up being the one who laughed last, as in 2014, Riddell began training at the Monster Factory, a gym of wannabe pro wrestlers. Matt would make his debut as a professional wrestler on February 7th, 2015, winning the Evolve Championship, WWN Championship, PWG World Tag Team Championship, and the Progress Atlas Championship twice. Riddell signed with the WWE in July 2018, debuting on NXT on October 31st, 2018. His NXT tenure included winning the NXT Tag Team Championship with Pete June as the Broserweights. He achieved further success winning the United States Championship on February 21st, 2021. His partnership with Randy Orton as the RK Bro was considered the highlight of his wrestling career, winning the Raw Tag Team Championship twice. But Riddell faced controversy in the WWE as well. This included multiple violations of WWE's wellness policy. In 2022, he was suspended for 60 days after testing positive for recreational drugs. Matt has since left the WWE and found success in lesser promotions, but his UFC career will always be a massive what-if scenario. He is clearly a very gifted athlete and could have gone extremely far in the organization if not for his failed drug tests. BJ Penn's psychosis. Former lightweight and welterweight world champion BJ Penn has had a rather chaotic few years as of late. In the last Iceberg, we discussed a few street fights that he had been in, and recently, it seems that he has undergone an episode of psychosis, claiming that his family has been murdered and subsequently cloned, replaced with mimics. I'll let the videos that BJ Penn has been posting speak for themselves. Most people think that this might be some kind of early onset CTE or something.
This lady right here, look at her ass and legs. She's acting like my 79-year-old mother, but she's not my 79-year-old mother. And it's interesting when you Google Lorraine Abele, our house pops up, because this lady acts like Lorraine Lenoy. So you Google Lorraine Abele, and this house pops up, and then you look and then my mom's name starts popping up. She's trying to steal everything, and this is not my mother. And I'm putting this up because she's saying that she's going to get an attorney and try to do something. She's trying to throw me out, and if I attack her, she'll try to do something, TRO or something else, but she's...
Dustin Lamporos, Predator Catcher. During 2024 and 2025, Dustin Lamporos, a 9-1 MMA fighter, virally emerged as the leader of the 561 Predator Catchers, a civilian group dedicated to catching suspected child predators, operating primarily in Delray Beach. The group poses as minors online to lure suspects to public locations such as grocery stores, gas stations and Walmarts. Once there, Lamporos and his team confront the individuals, often leading to their arrest by local law enforcement. Within just 5 months, their efforts had spurred around 20 arrests in Delray Beach. The operations of the 561 Predator Catchers is uploaded to their YouTube channel, which boasts over 200,000 followers. One video alone has garnered 2.1 million views. Lamporos claims that he is collaborating with the Delray Beach Police Department, stating that officers have provided guidance on making cases prosecutable, and even encouraged filming and uploading the confrontations for public awareness. Although, I guess it is worth noting that the police department officially denies any formal affiliation. Pliev finger. Perhaps one of the most gruesome injuries that I've ever witnessed in MMA is when Pliev was competing in a bout against Goodale at CFFC 94. At around the 1 minute mark of the second round, whilst being smothered by his opponent up against the cage, we can see his glove be stretched by his opponent, who is fighting for wrist control, and at this point, it is widely believed that the finger got trapped in the glove somehow, and then was completely severed off. We can see that the finger is missing around 30 seconds after standing up. The round would ultimately end, at which point Pliev notices that his ring finger is quite literally missing. Despite this, the absolute badass says that he wants to continue fighting. The fight would obviously be stopped, and they would find his missing finger in his glove, and apparently later they would be able to reattach it. The reason his finger was likely severed is because at some point in the first round he broke the finger due to a punch, making it weak and essentially held together by soft tissue and skin, and then when it became trapped, it was easily severed. Nasty stuff for sure. Darren Till's stabbing. Most people know that Darren Till moved to Brazil toward the beginning of his career when he was in his 20s, where he would continue his training towards a mixed martial arts career. There, he would also have a child who he doesn't really care about.
I've got a daughter in Brazil right now who I haven't seen for one yet. I don't really care.
Anyway, the reason for his escape to a new land was because he actually got stabbed in a nightclub in Liverpool. It was an incident that almost got him killed.
And then I looked down and my top was just red. It just changed the colour red and I was like, whoa. I think he had like army, so he put his fingers in my wound and he's going, I need you to stay awake. And I was going, nah. And I kept trying to like shut my eyes. And I remember being in the ambulance and I was going to the woman, just tell me if I'm gonna die. And she wouldn't answer me.
Igor Vovchanchin. Igor Vovchanchin is a Ukrainian mixed martial artist and holds a tied record with Travis Fulton for the longest unbeaten MMA streak, sitting at an extremely impressive 40 straight fights without losing. But what makes his stand out from Fulton, who is always fighting tomato cans, is the level of fighters that Igor was competing against. From the smashing machine Mark Kerr to Gary Goodridge and Sakuraba, his streak would come to a dramatic end in the Pride Grand Prix 2000's final, where he was kneed into submission by Mark Coleman. Igor would go on to become a true legend of Pride, finishing his career with a record of 56 wins and 8 losses, dancing in the rings with the likes of Alistair Overeem, Rampage Jackson and Mirko Krokop. Angela Hill's extraterrestrial story. In the last Iceberg we talked about JSP and his strange encounters with aliens, some of his stories of which have actually had multiple corroborating accounts. Well, now we bring one other fresh off the shelves. This time, number 12 ranked Angela Hill gives her family's account of a potential alien encounter that happened in the 60s. Buckle in, Bob Lazar fans, this one's a bit wild.
But my grandfather is Barney Hill, and he was one of the most famous... shit, I have allergies right now, it's gonna suck. But he is one of the most famous alien abductee stories from back in the 60s.
The Betty and Barney Hill incident would go down as one of the first and one of the most important claims in history of encounters with not merely a craft allegedly from another world, but the beings said to pilot it. It was fundamental towards drawing attention to and shaping public conceptions about alien abductions.
What happened was they were going up into the mountains to, like, you know, visit somewhere in New Hampshire. They saw a light, and the light was going over the mountains and kind of zipping around. Like, at first they thought, oh, it was probably like an airplane or something. He got his binoculars out and he saw it, and he could see people in a ship, and he was calling them Chinamen. He said, oh, they looked like Chinamen. Then all of a sudden the spaceship is on the road, and they see it on the road, like just bright lights. The car stops, like he can't drive the car anymore. And yeah, so they took them into the spaceship and they did all these experiments on them. And the reason they knew something had happened afterwards was because, like, they saw scuffs on my grandfather's shoes, like on the top of his shoes, because he was dragged in. He had like a weird rash where they like took a sample from his genitals. Betty, I forget what happened with her. She had like stains on her dress, and they gave her like a pregnancy test. And so they shoved something in her belly button or something like that. So they put him back in the car, and like Betty is having a great time. She like, they showed her the universe that they were from, and they're like, oh, we're from this place, and then later on she was able to draw it under hypnosis, but then they actually like located a set of stars like years later that looked like where they said they were from. So yeah, there's all these little things that make people who believe in aliens really believe in that story.
It's so strange how these stories, true or false, are always so well fleshed out, so detailed, almost as if they did actually happen. But I guess that's up for you to decide. Makayev tries to leverage UFC contract. Perhaps one of the more controversial things to happen in MMA in the last year or so was the release of top-ranked flyweight prospect Muhammad Makayev, who, after defeating Manel Kape at UFC 304, in an absolutely boring and dreadful decision, was released from the organization. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I couldn't have been more happy because Makayev is, well, he's a bit of a dick. Anyway, this all started because Makayev was known to be rude and inappropriate to UFC staff backstage, and whilst not a deal breaker, it is certainly annoying for people like Dana, who has massive respect for his employees and want them to be treated okay. Then Makayev would attack Cap during fight week, allegedly sucker punching the guy. They also had another run-in at the PI in Las Vegas. Anyway, leading up to UFC 304, Makayev's contract was up for renewal, and it was his last fight. Well, after the fact, Dana had this to say.
He's not under contract anymore.
Okay, but would you be interested in keeping him around in the fall?
I think the PFL is going to get a great undefeated guy.
People weren't exactly surprised to say the least. The writing was on the wall for Makayev, and his performance that night kind of sealed the deal. But there was a little more to Makayev's antics than just being a problem child for the matchmakers and staff. It turns out that Makayev had actually been leveraging negotiations with other organizations while still under contract with the UFC, which apparently you aren't allowed to do and can mean that your contract gets terminated. Whilst Makayev denies these allegations, Dana's quip about the PFL kind of says a lot. But it turns out the PFL would also completely reject Muhammad publicly as well.
Apparently he's just a pain in the ass to deal with, and so, no, we're not interested.
James Lynch would also come out to defend Muhammad, saying illegal communications never took place between Makayev and the PFL. But reading between the lines here, I personally think that means that the communications did in fact happen, they just weren't illegal. He was treading a fine line is what I believe happened. Makayev has since signed with Brave FC since leaving the UFC, and fought once over there winning his fight. But every day he begs to come back to the UFC, even offering to fight for free.
I said to Hunter Campbell, I said whatever I've done at the hotel, I'm ready to pay for that and fight next fight in UFC for free. Whatever trouble I made.
But Daddy Dana ain't letting him back. Yi Long is a renowned Chinese martial artist and kickboxer who made a name for himself with his self-proclaimed Shaolin monk persona. Yi Long's fighting style and traditional martial arts background have made him a fan favorite for a long time now, and you probably do recognize his characteristic Shaolin temple buttons and bald head. Inspired by his father's stories, he began training at 14 and was scouted for Sanda kickboxing, honing his skills at a sports university with rigorous daily sessions. Yi Long's career had been pretty rewarding to say the least, notably winning the 2007 Guangdong Foshan International Wing Chun Championship. Since 2009, he has competed in Wuling Feng, facing top fighters in disciplines like Muay Thai and Wushu. His fight record stands at 36 wins, 7 losses and 1 draw across super welterweight, and super middleweight divisions. His unorthodox fighting style, often leaving his guard down and relying on what he calls inner powers, sets him apart, though it leaves him vulnerable to attacks, particularly in kickboxing, where he's been chinned a couple of times. But why he is on this iceberg is because he's managed to find himself in some controversy. Whilst claiming for decades to be a Shaolin monk, it turns out that the Shaolin temple that he allegedly trained at absolutely left him in the dark, saying that he had never been there for those 5 years as a Shaolin monk, arguing that he misrepresented his background and that they in fact had never even seen him before. So his whole persona and backstory might actually just be a load of shit. Kevin Randleman's staff. Kevin Randleman is the former UFC heavyweight world champion, but he makes his way onto this list for what is more than likely the most horrific staph infection injury I think I've ever seen. If you just Google Kevin Randleman staph infection, you'll find a picture of it, because I literally cannot show it on this video without being demonetized. It's a terrible looking photo. Kevin unfortunately passed away at the age of 44 due to pneumonia. He died a legend of this sport, and a man not likely forgotten. Chris Barnett's wife. Chris Barnett might just be one of the funniest and entertaining heavyweights out there. Most of this community look forward to watching him step in the octagon, but in the fight preceding his viral knockout of Jean Volante, Chris's wife would contract encephalitis, a potentially deadly inflammation of the brain. He had already signed on to fight Martin Bidet, and so it was an extremely stressful time for his life, where not only did he have to train for a fight, to put food on the table and pay for medical expenses for his wife, but he would have to sit bedside at his wife's hospital bed day in, day out, not knowing if she would make it or not. Chris would ultimately lose his fight via technical decision, and upon Dana White finding out about Chris's situation, would reach out to him asking if he could help in any way. Although Chris is cagey about the exact details of what Dana White did, it seems that he in fact paid for all medical bills and gave Chris his win money despite losing. Unfortunately, 2 weeks after his loss, Chris's wife would pass away from her illness, leaving Chris to raise their 2 children alone. Chris, having no choice, would ultimately head back to the octagon just 4 months later, knocking out Jake Collier in just 2 rounds. He also managed to miss weight as a heavyweight at the time, which is a pretty shocking turn of events. Chris afterwards would set the stadium on fire with an electric post-fight interview, one of the best in the game, and I highly recommend checking out his UFC 279 post-fight interview. I'm sure we all look forward to him fighting again. Diego Garrido. In the cage, 7-1 Diego is a violent force to be reckoned with, but by night, when the lights go low and the booze flows, Diego becomes John Jones's wet dream, Lola, the drag queen. During the day, he trains sparring, grappling and conditioning his body for the cage, his knuckles calloused, his focus razor sharp, but when the sun sets, he trades fight gear for heels and a wig. Diego says fighting and drag aren't so different, both are about confidence, owning the moment. Balancing the contrasting worlds isn't easy, training eats up hours, and drag shows run late. Costumes cost money, and fight camps aren't cheap, yet he thrives on the grind. People want you in a box, he says, but I'm not here for that. But I do know who does want to trap him inside a little box. Justin Levens. Justin Levens was one of the first to vanguard a professional career into the Wild West of MMA, stepping foot on the blood-soaked mats way back in 2004. Quickly he would rise undefeated in the WEC, where after stringing 2 wins together in the light heavyweight division, he would get his opportunity to fight for the WEC title against Scott Smith. Whilst he ultimately fell short, he would find himself in the UFC in his very next fight, taking on Evan Tanner, but he couldn't get back to winning ways, ultimately going on a 3-fight losing skid. He would pick up 2 more wins after leaving the UFC, but that was the last taste of victory he would ever achieve, ending his MMA career in 2007 after losing a further 5 bouts in a row. This fall from grace, from an undefeated title challenger to a guy barely making a cent scrapping it out on the regional scene on a terrible losing streak, is a thing that sat heavy with the pro fighter. The nail in the coffin arrived when preparing for a fight in 2008. Levens would test positive for banned substances and be barred from the sport for up to 2 years, but Levens would never see the suspension through to finality. Levens' longtime friend and MMA training partner reported that Levens became depressed, weighed down by the inability to progress in the sport that he loved and unable to make money doing anything else. His life was difficult to say the least, compounded when Levens' other training partner, Jeremy Williams, unalived himself that same year for similar reasons. On December 2008, Justin was found deceased, along with his wife, in what the police investigated as a murder unalive event. Justin was found with the weapon at his side and no sign of a struggle. It's stories like these that show that whilst we often see the greatest moments of athletes in the UFC, their glistening careers under the brightest of lights, and their more than successful lifestyles, there lies underneath that an ugly and disturbing underbelly that is often less talked about. UFC fighters that no one knows, no one remembers, lost to time and space, their story of pain, of sacrifice and struggle, completely unnoticed, ended because they couldn't realize a dream that meant everything to them. Thiago Silva. Thiago Silva was a UFC vet, first fighting in the organization way back in 2007, eventually fighting a total of 12 times for the company, winning 7, losing 3 and 2 no contests, and his defeats often came from the best the organization could muster, the likes of Lyoto Machida, Rashad Evans and Alexander Gustafsson. But he doesn't make his way onto this iceberg because of his fights inside of the octagon. Whilst his career was going well, he would find himself in a little spot of bother. In February of 2014, Thiago would allegedly threaten Pablo Popovich at his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu center, and also his estranged wife, Thiasa Kamiji, who was in a relationship with Popovich. He was also allegedly seen brandishing a handgun and made some not-so-nice threats. The day before, Kamiji called police on Silva for violating a temporary protection order. He was charged with aggravated battery and non-violently resisting an officer. The charges were later lessened to aggravated assault. Following the arrest, Dana White said Silva will never fight in the UFC again. The UFC formally released him later that day, but in a twist that no one saw coming, and something that is completely in keeping with the justice system in the US, the charges against Silva would be completely dropped, meaning the UFC would actually go back and re-sign him a week later. However, someone clearly not happy with the fact that Silva got away with this crap decided to leak video evidence of him showing and presenting a handgun. The UFC subsequently released him and told him that he would never come back for real this time. Thiago Silva is one of the few men who have actually been permanently banned from the UFC. Silva would go on to fight in promotions such as ACB and Eagle FC, finishing his career in 2020 with a record of 21 wins and 9 losses and 3 no contests. TV show gets names wrong. Perhaps one of the greatest errors to have ever graced the world of the UFC broadcasting was an incident that took place sometime in 2010 or 2011. I can't actually find the exact date. It was when Frankie and George were both champions. In the video, Joe is required to introduce the fighters for the broadcast, and I got to say it's one of the most awkward things I've ever seen.
From the UFC, our former UFC champion Rashad Evans, UFC lightweight champion Frankie Edgar, and UFC welterweight champion George St. Pierre.
Harold Howard. Harold Howard's UFC career began in the nascent stages of the promotion. The echoes of this wild, unscripted and wacky time still reverberate with humor to this day.
Come on.
The nature of early mixed martial arts was indeed kind of ridiculous. He competed from 1994 to 1995, participating in UFC 3 and UFC 7. Although Harold served as a pioneer for the sport, he wouldn't really go anywhere after the fact. He sacrificed his blood for the canvas, and the offering meant naught. According to a report from mixedmartialarts.com, on December 22, 2009, Harold was charged with a series of serious offences following an early morning episode where he allegedly drove his truck through the entrance of a casino in Niagara Falls. Prior to smashing his way into the front of a casino like a main character from his own movie, Harold had been staying at his sister's home. His nephew was getting milk from the refrigerator when Harold suddenly attacked him with a hammer, striking him 5 or 6 times with the claw end of the weapon. Harold's sister entered the room after her son screamed for help, and then she was struck with the hammer and fell to the ground. The nephew, like a guy from WWE, smashed Harold over the head with a chair, which ended the attack. Howard then drove to a house on Carmen Street where his estranged spouse and son lived and struck her vehicle that was parked on the driveway. He then approached the front door and tried to gain entry, yelling, "You ruined my life." Well, it was only Harold that ruined his life that night, because he then went to a casino and drove through the front of it. Harold was sentenced to 5 years in prison for attempted murder. Strikeforce Brawl. This might just be one of the more famous moments from Nick and Nate Diaz, although as time ticks on and Nate and Nick kind of fizzle out of the mainstream, their highs and their most popular moments are actually kind of being forgotten about. So here goes, the Strikeforce Brawl. Broadcast live on CBS to an estimated 2.9 million viewers, the event featured a middleweight title fight between Jake Shields and Dan Henderson. Shields was a massive underdog for the fight, but he flipped the script by out-grappling the veteran Henderson over 5 rounds, securing a clear decision victory after surviving a barrage of powerful strikes in the first round. As Shields was being interviewed following his victory in the cage, Jason Mayhem Miller, the guy that we mentioned earlier in the Bully Beatdown, interrupted to demand a rematch, referencing their previous bout where Shields had narrowly defeated him. Shields would ultimately push Miller, and within moments, the situation escalated into a full-blown brawl. Gilbert Melendez, the at the time Strikeforce lightweight champion, and the Diaz brothers all joined in battering Mayhem, who was kicked and stomped on the floor. The whole situation led to the now iconic commentary line, "Sometimes these things happen in MMA." At the time when MMA was still striving for mainstream legitimacy, the incident was seen by many as a massive setback. CBS, a major network that had taken a chance on broadcasting Strikeforce, decided to never air MMA ever again. Diaz would ultimately apologize for the whole thing, but I guess the damage was done already. Biker Riot. On March 16, 2002, a casino in Cabazon, California, hosted the Ultimate Athlete MMA event, which, as is destined in all early MMA events, descended into absolute chaos. The Mongols Motorcycle Club, with an estimated 100 members in attendance, decided it would be a good time to kick off and beat some ass. The riot erupted during a fight between Rick Slatton and Leo Pavlushkin when a thrown beer cup led to a Mongol stabbing a fan, which I might add is quite the escalation. The 100 members just started beating the shit out of everyone from there. At least one fan was critically injured, requiring months of hospitalization, multiple surgeries and blood transfusions. Despite 45 security officers, the situation just spiraled completely out of control. That was until 100 sheriff cars turned up, with multiple officers armed with M16s. They shut down the parking lot for an hour. It was all cleared out by 11 PM apparently, leaving behind puddles of beer and puddles of blood. Described as the worst incident in American mixed martial arts history at the time, it significantly damaged MMA's legitimacy, which didn't help when people were calling the violent spectacle human cockfighting at the time. Welcome to Tier 5. This is where even more obscure things are discussed. Only true MMA fans will know of these entries, and even still, the most hardcores of the fans will become lost in the darkness of these depths. Strap in, it's about to get very strange. For Tita and Blair, there have long been rumours about the UFC brass abusing their position of power over fighters, from Dana White allegedly smashing Ronda Rousey, according to Brendan Schwab, to Dana White's mum accusing the UFC president of sleeping with ring girls.
You know, he has plenty the ring card girls sleep with him.
Well, all of that might have been proven with an accidental public tweet, courtesy of former UFC owner Lorenzo Fertitta, who asked Chrissy Blair what she was up to that night. The public tweet was quickly deleted, but that never stops anything, and those wanting to read between the lines thought that indeed something might be going on here. Leslie Smith's firing. A few fights after her ear exploded on national TV, Leslie found herself on a 2-fight win streak, and also on the last fight of her contract. She was scheduled to face Aspen Ladd, but after Aspen Ladd rather predictably missed weight, Leslie was given her win money and terminated from the company. They said that providing her win money was her completing her contract.
Aspen didn't make weight, so I tried to use the situation to negotiate an extension on my contract. The UFC said no, they would not extend my contract and give me any more fights. And then they said that they would pay me my show money and my win money for not fighting.
So the question is, why would the UFC drop a ranked fighter on a win streak? Well, here goes the alleged conspiracy according to the internet. In February of 2018, 2 months before her fight with Aspen, Smith launched Project Spearhead, an initiative to unionize UFC fighters to address alleged long-standing issues like low pay, inadequate healthcare, and also the classification of fighters as independent contractors rather than employees. As interim president of Project Spearhead, alongside Vice President Kajan Johnson, she aimed to collect authorization cards from 30% of the UFC roster to push for union recognition. This was a pretty bold move for a rostered fighter in the company. As discussed, Smith's contract was shortly terminated. The UFC paid her $62,000, but declared her as a free agent, a decision she believed was retaliation for her activism. She filed a complaint with the National Labor Relations Board, alleging unlawful termination, but the case was dropped by 2020. The timing of her release, just months after Project Spearhead, fueled speculation that the UFC aimed to quash unionization efforts. Project Spearhead struggled, as many fighters were hesitant to join after what had happened to Leslie. By 2025, no UFC fighters union has formed. Smith's release, whilst it is certainly extremely suspicious, was unproven as retaliation, but there are two pieces to this puzzle that I'm going to give you now that you can form your own opinion from. Firstly, apparently and allegedly, Leslie was always tough to deal with behind the scenes, which, if you ask me, is pretty characteristic for someone who would openly try and start a union in the company that she was contracted for. And not only that, she outright refused to fight Aspen Ladd, even though she was only 0.8 pounds over the limit.
Why didn't I fight just anyway? Because that would have been purely out of pride so that people would know I'm not scared of Aspen. But I fought Cyborg, so, you guys know I wouldn't be scared of freaking Aspen.
This messed up the card as it was a highly anticipated fight, so the UFC might have been annoyed by these two things. Again, this is just speculation. But the other thing that buys into the conspiracy is that the Labour Relations Board that dealt with Leslie's complaint initially approved it, but then just a few hours later, it was transferred to Washington, D.C., a different board, who then proceeded to reject the already approved complaint. But here goes the thing though, the head of the board was extremely good friends with Donald Trump, and it just so happened that Dana White had allegedly had dinner with the sitting president at the time. So again, do with that information what you want. Khabib debt issues. Back in 2024, Khabib got into a spot of bother with the Russian Federal Tax Commission after they conducted an investigation that concluded that the Dagestani fighter had been avoiding paying his taxes to the sweet sum of $3.3 million. The government would then freeze his bank accounts and the bank accounts of all of his businesses, whilst Khabib would eventually cut the check and pay his way. It did mean the collapse of many of his businesses, including Eagle FC, which was kind of failing anyway. Conor, not one to not take any opportunity to take the piss out of Khabib, would send this delightful message on screen now, saying that he was going to buy his residence and then take a big smelly Irish shit in it. Well, the story doesn't end there. Earlier this year in April, Khabib would fail to submit his tax documents on time and have his bank account frozen once more. There's been no update since then, but it's fairly clear to me that Khabib needs to fire whoever his accountant is. Tim Kennedy's stolen valor. Tim Kennedy, a former UFC middleweight and a currently serving US Army Special Forces soldier, in recent months got himself on the wrong side of those alpha male soldier podcast folk accusing Tim of stolen valor. Tim, like most men who seek to monetize their service, would detail in his 2022 memoir titled Scars and Stripes an unapologetically American story of fighting the Taliban, UFC warriors and myself, which, conveniently, is also a stolen title of another book and memoir. Whilst we probably all know Tim more for his gutsy fights against opponents like Yoel Romero and Michael Bisping, Kennedy's military service has been a cornerstone of his public persona, and rightly so. He has certainly served his country valiantly and honourably. But here goes the crux of the issue. The allegations brought mainly to our attention by the Anti-Hero podcast centre on discrepancies in Kennedy's book. Critics, including former Special Forces teammates, challenged many of the claims that he has lived by, including being a distinguished honour graduate at the Rangers School. Records drug out of the closet actually showed that he almost failed Rangers School, and then Kennedy's DD-214 military record lacks a Purple Heart, despite Kennedy bragging about how he got a load of shrapnel in his body on a mission in Afghanistan. And then there's also stories such as throwing 25 grenades into a building or engaging in hand-to-hand combat. These have all been disputed by veterans who were allegedly present, many of his former teammates calling them implausible or fabricated.
Tim, you filleted yourself, brother, when you did that. So I'm doing you a favor by telling everybody that did not happen. Right. So the international criminal courts won't come after you.
Kennedy's claim of possessing a Bronze Star with valor has also been questioned, with no supporting evidence on his service record.
That is textbook stolen valor.
Kennedy would come out acknowledging his imperfect recollections in a video titled Setting the Record Straight, and in an interview on the Overdog podcast, insisting he never intended to mislead. He cited the chaos of combat and poor paperwork as reasons for inconsistencies. This whole subject is something that I actually want to get into, and after I finish the MMA Guru doc next, Tim will more than likely be the next video in the pipeline for me. It will be an interesting video, and I look forward to being able to tell Tim's UFC journey as well. I think that a lot of people get him wrong. Jared Gordon addiction, the man best known for being robbed by Paddy Pimblett, had a rather troubled start to his adulthood. Gordon's addiction to an illegal substance began at the age of 19, triggered by an injury that led to a prescription of pain medication and then quickly escalated into much more. By 21, he was fully addicted, and by 23, he was homeless, panhandling on the streets of Queens, New York to support his habit. It was so bad that he even had 3 overdoses, with the final one in 2015 inside a motel room, leaving him clinically dead for 2 minutes. But this brush with death itself became the catalyst for his recovery. His path to recovery included 10 rehab stints. Despite his addiction, Gordon never abandoned his passion for MMA, even during his darkest days. He trained and fought, though often under the influence, with a notable low point being shooting up at Donald Cerrone's BMF ranch whilst training with Paul Felder. After achieving sobriety, he returned to fighting with renewed focus, debuting in the UFC in 2017. As of now, Gordon's UFC record stands at 21 wins, 6 losses and 1 robbery and 1 no contest. The death of Doug Dedge. Dedge, a father of 5, who ran an MMA school in Enterprise, Alabama, traveled to Kiev, Ukraine for the International Super Challenge, an unregulated event billed as Ukraine against the world, facing Ukrainian grappler Yevgeny Zolotarev. Dedge attempted a takedown, but was mounted and struck with 14 punches to the head. He tapped out, stood up briefly, and then collapsed. 2 days later, on March 18th, he died from severe brain injuries at the Kiev Institute for Neurosurgery. It was no surprise that Dedge's death sent shockwaves through the community. UFC co-founder Art Davie, who in 1988 had recently been ousted from the company, cited it as the reason for him to personally pivot to kickboxing, whilst UFC owner Bob Merowitz pushed for regulation. Not out of the ordinary though, the media got it wrong and mislabeled it an ultimate fighting death, fueling further problems with the UFC. Conor's UFC 303 withdrawal. Conor McGregor's withdrawal from UFC 303 2 weeks before it was expected to take place was definitely a big hit for the company, and although Alex stepped in and saved the card, many people were rightly fairly annoyed that they had spent literally thousands of dollars securing a ticket for the event, one of the most expensive in the company's history. It was eventually revealed that Conor had broken his itty-bitty toe.
You must understand, my foot was a balloon. Do you know what I mean? My toes came out of the socket and my foot was a balloon. I went in, I tore my leg to shreds.
And that is why he didn't want to partake in the festival of violence. And whilst many people called him a pussy for it, I kind of got why Conor did it. He literally needs a win, and any little niggle was not ideal. So whilst Conor shite himself on the bus, the UFC pressed on, but the conspiracies grew in volume. Did Conor do it for money? To renegotiate a contract? Did he do it because he popped for an illegal substance?
Because you've heard all the conspiracy theories about Conor. He's not really hurt. He really just wants to negotiate.
Conor McGregor has never done that. Conor McGregor is hurt right now. It's absolutely real.
Whilst Dana parried these accusations, people weren't exactly convinced, to say the least. Months later, Jake Paul would come out with a pretty remarkable accusation, and one that seemed far too much of a deep cut for it not to bear some kind of truth. I'll let the Paul brother explain his take on the situation.
Conor has 2 fights left on his fight deal, but the UFC is trying to renew their rights deal. A part of that negotiation is, hey, we have Conor McGregor for 2 more fights. But if he were to fight now, that wouldn't be a part of the negotiation. The company would be like, oh yeah, well you only have Conor for one fight.
The conspiracy was then given further depth as the UFC GOAT duck himself, John Jones, has essentially avoided fighting Tom for basically a year and a half now, under the guise of many different excuses. Whilst many feel like it's John Jones being heavy-handed in his negotiating, like he always is, some believe that this drawn-out process was all a part of the UFC negotiating their TV deal, saying that they have pay-per-view stars like John Jones, Conor McGregor, and teasing the return of Amanda Nunes, and all of this seems like a very calculated play by the UFC to beef up their negotiating. Apparently the UFC has now secured their TV rights deal, and conveniently John Jones just retired. On the Conor McGregor front, it hasn't really worked out though, because the man is still in nightclubs punching people. Abdul Karim Edilov. Edilov's professional career began in the early 2010s, culminating in a UFC debut in September of 2017, where he secured a second-round knockout. The debut followed a 15-month suspension for testing positive for meldonium. Edilov's MMA record stood at an impressive 17 wins and 4 losses, including a spectacular victory over our autistic samurai Yuri Prohashka. Beyond the octagon, though, lay Edilov's true calling. Edilov had a very close relationship with Kadyrov, the Chechenian dictator. In November 2021, he was appointed chief of staff for Kadyrov, and by 2022, he ascended to the role of deputy prime minister of Chechnya. His personal connection with Kadyrov extended to training and guarding the leader's 3 teenage sons. However, it all quickly started to unravel, as in September of 2022, allegations of drug use emerged, reportedly leading to his conviction and torture by Kadyrov's enforcers, followed quickly by his resignation as deputy prime minister on November 23rd. It was officially stated as his own decision, but I think that we can all read between the lines on this one. Less than a month later, Edilov was found dead under circumstances that remain unclear. The lack of any kind of knowledge or reporting surrounding his death has obviously given way to a lot of speculation and conspiracy theories. As we all know, Kadyrov's regime has long been associated with the human rights abuses, so although there is no evidence, it is assumed that Edilov had annoyed Kadyrov in some way, and as quickly as he rose to power in the country, he was dismissed in the most horrific of ways. Gerald Strabent. Gerald was known for his fighting name of the Finishing Machine, and made his name as the first student of renowned conspiracy nut and jiu-jitsu legend Eddie Bravo. Gerald would be the first fighter to execute a twister submission in MMA, achieving it in a match in 2004 against Dave Elliott at Cage Warriors 7. Gerald's record stands at 9 wins and 7 losses, and in the UFC he debuted at UFC 44, facing top lightweight Josh Thompson, where he was knocked out in the first round. He also competed in promotions such as Extreme Challenge and King of the Cage, showcasing his grappling prowess. Gerald, however, makes his way onto this list though because of an incident that took place in January of 2014, when he was involved in a fatal shooting in Springfield, Oregon. After a minor dust-up of cars hitting each other, Gerald got out and started shouting at the man that had crashed into him, and then feeling like his life was in threat, as the man that had crashed into him threatened to kill him, he went into his car, retrieved his rifle, and then ended the mission.
I can't. He's at my vehicle. He ran up on my vehicle. I'm hitting on purpose.
Okay, hold on.
Get back from me, sir. Get back from me. Man, I can't see his hands. It's dark. I can't see him.
Gerald.
Get back.
Stay calm, Gerald.
He was arrested and charged with murder on March 6, 2014. The murder charge was dismissed due to mitigating evidence, and Gerald pleaded guilty to criminally negligent homicide. He served time in prison and was released in 2017, but would quickly find himself back in prison in 2018 after being caught doing some heinous things to an underage female. I don't know what it is about these early MMA fighters, but they have the most incredible falls from grace. And so there you have it. The first man to pull off a twister is a complete nutjob. 28-0. So according to this entry, Khabib might in fact have lied his way to 29-0. Whilst many people know about the fight that he potentially lost against Gleison Tibau, this one refers to a fight early in his career where there appears to be no footage of this fight ever taking place, even though the whole event has actually been recorded elsewhere. One of the only fights that I actually can't find footage of is of Eldar Eldarov, and there is even footage of the fight before that in the tournament where Khabib beat somebody, but for some reason the final of the tournament was never recorded, so I believe that this is referring to the fight against Eldar Eldarov. So even though this is listed as a win on his record, there is actual no footage of this fight ever taking place, and so the theory goes that at least one of his fights on his record is completely made up. Again, I'm not sure if it is Eldar Eldarov, but there is a lot of talk of this on forums. UFC fake fans. So in the last Iceberg we talked about a leaked email chain that discussed how the UFC wanted to leak footage and pose as fans on a forum in order to engage real fans over a new season of The Ultimate Fighter. Well, I kind of want to revisit this theory, and so not only is that leak 100% true, but there is a wider conspiracy where many now speculate that there are legitimate UFC employees going around on YouTube and Reddit posing as fans to either drum up conversation, stir the pot, or try to sway public opinion on upcoming fights. Cindy O is a great example of this, who was a person with an account on the Underground forum who used to be very pro-UFC. Anyway, without being too cryptic, I can actually confirm that a major organization not only poses as fake fans on social media, but they also actually have social media content creator plants who work for said organizations that are on the payroll, but act like they're just fans of the sport and make videos here on YouTube. I'm not talking about the UFC, because they don't need to pay anybody to make content for them, all us suckers just do it for free anyway. But yeah, I know it's happening, and I know that there's major organizations putting out content pretending that they're just fans, but they're actually not. So I guess it's always just important to remain vigilant on this platform, and to know that not everything is as it seems. Dana White ended Affliction. Affliction MMA, launched by Affliction Clothing in 2008, you know, those t-shirts that everybody used to wear in the early 2000s, was pitched as some kind of like formidable rival to the UFC, with its deep pockets and a roster featuring legends such as Fedor Emelianenko, Vitor Belfort, and Josh Barnett. Affliction aimed to challenge UFC's stranglehold on the sport. Its debut event, Affliction Banned, drew massive attention when Emelianenko dispatched former UFC champion Tim Sylvia in just 36 seconds. A second event, Day of Reckoning, furthered the violent success. However, Affliction's ambitions were razed to ash and dust in July 2009 when its third event, Affliction Trilogy, was cancelled, leading to the promotion's sudden and permanent collapse. Conspiracy theories soon emerged, pointing fingers at the UFC president Dana White as the mastermind behind Affliction's demise. This was all wacky and all unproven stuff, of course, but I'll try and explain what the internet had theorized. The controversy hinges on like a couple of events that all took place in quick succession to one another. So firstly, on July 22nd, 2009, Josh Barnett, set to face Emelianenko in the Trilogy main event, tested positive for anabolic steroids, prompting the California State Athletic Commission to deny his fight license. Affliction cancelled the event and announced that it would exit the fight promotion business entirely, but within hours of the cancellation, Affliction Clothing inked a sponsorship deal with the UFC. I mean, literally hours later. So at 1 PM, Affliction had announced that it had cancelled its promotion business entirely, and 5 hours later at 6 PM, they had announced this deal with the UFC. So that's obviously quite weird. And so the second part to this is that July 2009 was an extremely crowded month for MMA, with 7 major organizations, including 2 UFC cards, threatening to split pay-per-view revenue. Neutralizing Affliction would consolidate the UFC's dominance and allow it to absorb top talent like Emelianenko and Belfort, and I mean, we all know how that went. Some even speculated that White influenced Barnett's drug testing failure to sabotage the event. Josh's drug test was the very first to ever be conducted by CSAC, and how weird would it be that they went to Josh of all people 2 days before the event? But I mean, the biggest criticism of this conspiracy is that Josh had a pretty good history of failing drug tests anyway, so he was bound to fail it if they came after him regardless, and CSAC would obviously try and go for him because they know that he has that history, right? And then we come to the clothing brand deal. I think that it's just a really obvious decision to make. If Affliction has ended their promotion business, then it makes sense to put the most popular clothing at the time on UFC fighters, so I kinda get it, and Dana White probably just swooped in and got a good deal there. Jones is serving a USADA violation. When John Jones decided to relinquish his light heavyweight title in August of 2020, according to him, he wanted to secure a super fight with Francis Ngannou for the heavyweight title, and wanted time to bulk up and be a big boy. What many people theorize though, is that John Jones actually did this because he had been caught once again by USADA, and he was in fact secretly carrying out a 2-year suspension from the sport. I don't really know if this adds up, but this is what people like to say. And it's not like John Jones hasn't been caught before now, is it? Romero killed someone. I mean, this one is a little bit of a deep cut, but here it goes. 5 years ago, Cuban scientific experiment Yoel Romero was asked about his biggest regret in life by the Mac Life Oscar Willis. His response to that question has led many people to believe that Yoel's turbulent time in his communist country, Cuba, led him to taking another man's life, or alternatively sold his people out, which would have led to their death or capture by authorities when trying to escape Cuba to the USA. And I know that that sounds stupid, and that that's such a massive long shot from the clip, but I'll play it now and you can draw your own conclusions as to whether he'd actually killed somebody or not.
What does he think the biggest mistake he's made in his life was, and what did he learn from it?
You don't want to know.
I don't want to know.
You don't want to know.
It was that bad a mistake?
You don't want to know.
Choice Center. So speaking of deep cuts, Choice Center, a Las Vegas-based organization labeled by critics as a cult and multi-level marketing scheme, was founded in 1998 by Robin Williams, not the actor. Choice Center offers costly courses such as the $5,000 Journey Within 15 program and the $1,500 per hour coaching sessions. Participants progress through the ranking systems, but this isn't no UFC rankings. Oh no. So I hear you ask, how is this related to the UFC? Well, it has been discovered that UFC light heavyweight title challenger Khalil Roundtree reportedly has reached level 126, and UFC bantamweight GOAT Dominic Cruz has reached an impressive level of 171. This whole thing was uncovered by people going through Choice Center's marketing materials. Needless to say, there's lots of critics of Choice Center, including many former members, who allege cult-like tactics such as sleep deprivation, meal restrictions, and pressure to recruit others, with some reviews claiming participants are told the group is their only family. So I mean, this sounds exactly like a cult, right? And videos from it aren't exactly great either. Sean Strickland on Joe Rogan's podcast in 2023 would kind of blow the lid on the whole thing, although he was pretty loose with details.
I mean, he's also in a cult, by the way. Khalil Roundtree's in a cult, too.
What do you mean? They're in a cult?
Yeah, they're like in a weird cult.
What cult?
I can't stand Khalil Roundtree.
He has since talked absolute shit about people like Khalil and the cult since then. The organization's high costs and vague promises of personal growth have drawn comparisons to pyramid schemes. Though some participants praise its impact on their lives, the whole thing about rising up through levels just sounds, well, it sounds exactly like Scientology, to be honest, and we all know how great that organization is, right? Cruz and Roundtree have not publicly addressed the allegations in depth. I've chucked some videos down in the description for you to check out because it's a proper rabbit hole, but it was kind of shocking to me to learn that somebody as seemingly intelligent and cerebral as Dominic Cruz would fall for this utter bullshit. An early stoppage. So earlier in this iceberg we talked about the 3 rounds and 1/10 fight that took place in Cage Warriors. Well, now we have the exact opposite from the cage side officials, but this one's a bit deeper. So Gerald Harris was taking part in a bout with Miquel Flacco at UFC 123. Harris was on a pretty remarkable 3-fight first round finish streak, and the UFC were definitely pushing him to soar up the rankings. The debuting Flacco was a lamb being led to slaughter according to most fans, another carcass for the highlight reel. Well, that was until 10 seconds before the end of the first round, where he put Harris in a fight-ending rear naked choke. There was quite literally no way for Harris to escape, and with 10 seconds left on the clock, he was certainly going to sleep imminently. Well, that was until the horn sounded, a whole 7 seconds before the actual end of the round. The conspiracies immediately started flowing in. Did the cage side official have money on the fight? Did the UFC have their hand in this, trying to get their fighter out of a losing position? Who knows, but it was certainly one of the most suspicious and controversial things that I've certainly ever seen. The whole problem with it though is that Harris would ultimately go on and lose on a unanimous decision regardless, and the UFC would officially calm people's conspiratorial claims by stating that, hey, sometimes cage side officials just make mistakes. It's just that simple. Welcome to Tier 6, the darkest depths. MMA fans crave this knowledge, but once you hear it, you may never be the same again. The Russians are doping. So I guess there are a lot of moving parts to this theory, but anyone who has spent any amount of time consuming this sport through the slits of your eyelids will know that the Russians love to pop for tainted substances. But the theory goes that these are indeed the unlucky ones, and that many of them are secretly partaking in the use of banned substances, but are just simply getting away with it. All we have to do is look at perhaps the most famous camp coming out of Russia, and that is Khabib's camp, formerly his father's, fighting out of Dagestan. 4 prominent members have failed. Tukagov in 2016 tested positive for Osterine. Khabib's cousin Abu Bakr tested positive for drosterone in 2019. Islam Makhachev in 2016 flagged positive for meladonium. And then Khabib's other cousin Usman Nurmagomedov, the champion in Bellator, also tested positive for a banned substance. And so the theory goes that it seems mighty suspicious that 4 people in such close proximity to one another would all be testing positive for the most random of drugs. You'd think that after one gets hit with a suspension from a contaminated substance, that the others would be more careful. And it all seems like many different people, all taking different substances that are all contaminated with all random different drugs. It's just all very convenient if you ask me. Then you add in another layer to this. 5 years ago, an athletic study was conducted, and it was reported that many UFC fighters complained in this study that there have been long-standing rumors about certain areas not being tested to the same level as others. Here's an excerpt that I'll read from that report. There are many people who live in Russia that aren't tested, a UFC fighter said. There are many people who go to Thailand and aren't tested either. It's a way of bypassing the anti-doping testing. That's the truth. Everybody who goes to Russia or to Thailand to do camps, they are doing it to dope, to take steroids and get away with it. Another UFC competitor added, I truly feel like there are a lot of foreign fighters still getting away with stuff. I'm hugely in support of drug testing. They can test me whenever they want to. I just want it to be the same for everybody. So there is that. And if anybody is to know if anybody's taking substances, it's going to be the fighters who are closest in proximity to all the rumors, and many of them are obviously very suspicious of certain fighters from certain camps and certain places. Then comes the second layer to this conspiracy. USADA themselves have openly discussed the inadequacies of anti-doping efforts in Russia. Here's what they said in 2020. Anti-doping in Russia is still a mess. Russian sport interfering with the NATO is a violation of WADA code. Gayness at least deserves an independent audit performed by credible entity, not by Russian sport. And then I guess finally, one of the main things that everybody talks about is the fact that Russian fighters only ever really fight 1 or 2 times a year, which many people speculate aligns with them doing doping cycles. Obviously, a lot of these fighters are Muslim, and this gets in the way of Ramadan, but people feel like this is a guise. When you look at the absolute dominance of Khabib and his entourage, it's hard not to think that something crazy isn't going on here. Combine this with documentaries like Icarus, which puts Russian athletes at the center of a doping scandal, it's extremely difficult not to think that something strange is going on here. But that's kind of the bird's eye view of the whole situation. What do you guys think of this theory? Kat Zingano. In 2013, Kat Zingano was an undefeated bantamweight prospect, rising through the newly minted UFC division, with Ronda Rousey leading the pack. In April of that year, Kat Zingano had dispatched top contender Miesha Tate, firmly setting herself up for a title shot, but unfortunately, a major injury would set her back for at least a year. And so at the turn of 2014, Kat Zingano would be blindsided by something that she would never have thought would have ever have happened. Her husband of 4 years, Brazilian black belt and renowned MMA coach Mauricio Zingano, would take his own life on the 13th of January. The news would absolutely cripple her.
That I actually didn't even get to tell people that he died. You know, being my position in the UFC and the fact that I'm under a microscope as a professional athlete, you know, the word spread before, you know, noon the next day. Still, you know, it's something that I struggle with every day. It's something that our family struggles with every day. It's a very uncomfortable club to be in.
Zingano would just 9 months later, after such an horrific circumstance, walk to the octagon, TKOing future women's goat of the sport Amanda Nunes, reaffirming her spot as the title challenger. She would get her shot at UFC Gold, but unfortunately she crossed paths with another woman on her own path to glory. Zingano has since set up a scholarship for those recently bereaved. Strange Brew. So this is one that I've wanted to include on this iceberg literally for the last 3 videos, but just found trying to include it a really difficult task. And that is because the story has been told perfectly by Chuck Mindenhall in an article that he wrote for MMA Fighting entitled In Search of Strange Brew. It's probably one of the greatest articles that I've ever had the pleasure of reading, and one of the finest in MMA, up there with some of the stuff that Jack Slack writes. So I was always tepid of trying to retell it, as I didn't want to steal the light from that article. So it's linked in the description, and I highly recommend you go give it your full attention. And from here I'm just going to very lightly summarize it, but realistically the reason it's this deep on the iceberg is because of the article itself, and not necessarily because of something dark or conspiratorial. The article, published on MMAfighting.com on March 24, 2015, details the life of Jason Thacker, a contestant on the first season of The Ultimate Fighter way back in 2004. He got to be known as Strange Brew on the show, a rather strange name, but it makes sense if you've watched the season. Thacker was cast specifically to kind of fit a criteria. The UFC wanted him to be the relatable everyman, and wanted to contrast him with the more tough, grizzled, jacked, white, seasoned MMA fighters. However, his lack of experience in mixed martial arts led to his elimination in the second episode, without ever throwing a single punch. He was, however, invited back to the live finals, but would lose his professional MMA debut with a 95-second TKO loss to Chris Liban. Thacker was essentially the punchline for every single joke in the first 2 episodes, including pranks such as having his bed urinated on. But it didn't stop after the show. Back home in Canada, people would heckle him and even try to fight him. Thacker's participation in TUF had long-lasting negative effects on his life. In the article, he is now 39 years old and living in Wannock, Canada. He leads a reclusive life, caring for his family, but struggling with depression, social anxiety, and a lack of employment or social connections. Initially reluctant to speak out on his experience, Thacker eventually shared his unpreparedness for the show, and how the humiliation he endured on the show profoundly impacted his mental health, leading him to believe that TUF actually ruined his life. Thacker's life lives as a kind of embodiment of the contrasting dichotomy of this sport, the organization's commercial success, and that of the personal outcome of many of its participants. Whilst the UFC has grown into a global phenomenon, with top fighters achieving fame and financial rewards, many others, like Thacker, are just simply left behind. The article, again linked in the description, perfectly reflects on this issue. For every champion celebrated in the UFC, there are numerous fighters whose names fade into obscurity. These individuals, who often risk their health and well-being to compete, may find themselves isolated and unsupported once their careers end. Again, it would be great if you guys could go check out the article. It really is beautiful. Mark Hunt's childhood. This is probably one of the most horrific entries on this iceberg, and one that I will 100% struggle to even talk about due to YouTube's rules on this. So all I will say is, if you want to truly understand how disgusting this all is, then please read Mark Hunt's autobiography, Born to Fight. I read it about 3 years ago, and it's truly an inspiring read. Mark Hunt is one of the greatest fighters that ever graced the octagon. His one-punch knockouts will live on forever, and he defined the heavyweight division for a time. His childhood, however, is what makes his way onto this list. And again, whilst I can't really talk about anything in particular in detail, what I will say is, Mark was essentially tortured by his father. His sister, on the other hand, got the worst of it. The whole family knew what he was doing, but they could do nothing about it. Mark and his siblings struggled to come to terms with this abuse, and they still never really even talk about it to this day. Again, I can't really say more, so all I'll say is, read Born to Fight, support Mark and his story. Amar Suliev. Amar Suliev was an Armenian MMA fighter with a professional record of 24 wins and 7 losses. Suliev showcased his skills in major promotions, including the UFC, Pride and Cage Rage M1 Global as well. However, like most men in tiers 5 and 6 of this iceberg, he isn't here for being a journeyman in MMA. No, Amar was a bit of a criminal, it would seem. It's quite interesting to point out that Suliev is credited with the first use of the Suliev stretch, a knee bar variant applied from back control, executed in a 2002 win over Paul Cahoon. His submission has since been used by the likes of award-winning actor Aljamain Sterling and MMA phantom Zabit Magomed Sharipov. Following his MMA career though, Suliev reportedly worked for a private security company named Van, before becoming caught up in some rather serious criminal allegations. In 2013 he was arrested in Russia, accused of being a contract killer and a part of a gang led by businessman Sergei Zirinov, accused of being involved in 4 murders and 1 attempted murder along Russia's Black Sea coast. The investigation reported Amar being caught up in some truly wild shit. However, it seems he kind of got away with it after eyewitness descriptions of one of the murders did not consistently match Suliev as one of the people involved, and a neighbor provided an alibi for the morning of the attempt. These discrepancies meant that Suliev was able to be released on bail, and then he was quickly diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer. He died on June 27, 2016 at the age of 40, leaving the allegations unresolved. Jordan Parsons was a 25-year-old mixed martial arts fighter, and he became rather unfortunately a landmark for medicine in MMA when he was diagnosed with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the first publicly reported case in MMA. The problem is that it can only be diagnosed after death, which is what we'll get onto in a minute. Parsons was a talented featherweight in Bellator, boasting a professional record of 11 wins and 2 losses. His promising career was cut short on May 4, 2016, when he was killed in a hit-and-run accident in Delray Beach, Florida, struck by a vehicle whilst crossing an intersection. In October of 2016, Dr. Benay Omalu, the forensic pathologist who identified CTE in NFL players like Mike Webster, announced Parsons' diagnosis following an autopsy conducted by Julia K. Kolfer. The findings confirmed that Parsons' CTE developed from repeated trauma sustained during his fighting career, not from the fatal accident. CTE is a progressive degenerative brain disease, and it is linked to repeated traumatic brain injuries that can manifest as memory loss, confusion, depression, and progressive dementia. It's something that I have covered at length in my video on CTE a couple years ago. It's one of the first videos I ever posted on my channel, and probably one of the best videos I've ever made, to be honest. Bellator's president Scott Coker responded by reaffirming the organization's commitment to fighter safety, which is funny when they're all just getting knocked out. But Scott Coker did make a donation to Jordan Parsons' Memorial Scholarship Fund. The family's lawyer of Jordan, though, emphasized education over litigation, hoping that diagnosis would inform athletes and medical professionals about CTE risks in the sport, which I think is the only step that you can take, to be honest. We don't want to stop people chasing their dreams, but they absolutely have to be aware of the risks, because some people like to deny that this ever actually happens. The death of Ryan Gracie. Ryan Gracie was the youngest son of Robson Gracie and grandson of the great Carlos Gracie, one of the founders of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Growing up in the Gracie family, naturally he was immersed in martial arts from a young age, training at Gracie Barra and later opening his own academy in Sao Paulo, he achieved a 4th degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and competed in mixed martial arts, fighting most prestigiously in Pride, where he fought 7 times with a record of 5 wins and 2 losses. Known for his street fighting background, Ryan earned the nickname as the bad boy of the Gracie family. Ryan would get caught up in substance abuse and numerous run-ins with the law, but on December 15, 2007, Ryan was arrested in Sao Paulo for stealing and crashing a car, then attempting to steal a motorcycle. During the incident, he was hit on the head by the motorcycle's owner and detained by cyclists until police arrived. At the time, he tested positive for an illegal substance and an unknown anxiety drug. Whilst in jail, his wife called their psychiatrist, who went to the jail and then prescribed a cocktail of 6 different medications in order to soothe pain and calm Ryan down. But unfortunately, Ryan was found dead in his cell at 7 AM, slumped in the corner during a routine check. The evidence leans towards his death being linked to the combination of those drugs, though the exact cause was not explicitly stated. This led to a controversy, with the family blaming the psychiatrist for medical negligence. The doctor was later sentenced to 1 year and 4 months of community service and a fine for manslaughter, negligence, imprudence, and malpractice. Ryan tragically left behind a 6-year-old son, who later grew up to become a jiu-jitsu expert in his own right, but more importantly, made a short film called Letters to My Father, detailing his father's life. It's a poignant little short film, linked in the description if you guys want to shed a tear. The Shedden Massacre. Marcelo Aravena. Before his involvement in the Bandidos, he was a professional mixed martial arts fighter with a record of 7 wins and 31 losses and 1 draw, billing himself as El Condor, although that seems like too much of a badass name for someone who has 31 losses on his record, to be honest. Additionally, he was a taekwondo enthusiast and worked as a bouncer in a strip club. This strip club was owned by Dwight Big D Mushy, the secretary of the Winnipeg Bandidos chapter. Marcelo would eventually move into Mushy's basement, paying $100 for rent, which, let's face it, that's pretty cheap, you'd all do the same, but it was ultimately what would put him in orbit of becoming a member of the Bandidos. Despite not owning or knowing how to ride a motorcycle, which you would think is a prerequisite to becoming a member, they still let him in, because they saw him as useful for muscle, although they probably had never actually taken a look at his MMA record, because if they had, they would realize that he's pretty much goddamn useless in a fight. Joining these guys would turn out to be the worst decision of his entire life, as this MMA fighter would be tied to one of the most controversial mass murders Canada has ever known. The Shedden Massacre, occurring on April 8, 2006, involved the murder of 8 members of the Bandidos Toronto chapter, known as the No Surrender Crew, whose bodies were found in a field 5 kilometers north of Shedden, Ontario. The massacre was a result of an internal gang conflict, with the victims summoned to a late-night meeting and held captive in a barn before being executed one by one. The bodies were then transported to a field and abandoned, discovered by the farmer the next day. Yves Levine, an expert on outlaw bikers, characterized it as following: "It was amateurish killings of men of low intelligence perpetrated by men of low intelligence." I mean, that's probably the biggest diss I've ever heard about a mass murder, but there we are, that's what he said about the fact. But I guess he had a point about the whole low intelligence thing, because this bike gang was hiring fighters on a 35 losing streak like Marcelo. Marcelo arrived at the farm to assist with pulling patches, apparently, a term for removing the Bandidos' patches from the victims, signaling their expulsion from the group. On the night of April 7th, 2006, he patrolled outside the barn armed with a rifle and a shotgun, guarding the area during the executions. He did in fact though go and fetch another rifle for Kelstein when his weapon jammed, so this is what got him directly involved in the murders. After it was all said and done, Marcelo was promoted within the gang, now wearing a fat Mexican patch, sewn on by his own mother. She probably had no idea what had just happened. Following the discovery of the bodies, Marcelo was arrested along with the others. The trial, lasting 7 months, concluded on October 29, 2009, with Marcelo being found guilty of 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter. He was sentenced to life in prison with no parole for at least 25 years. And so I guess that we're catching a theme here with fighters who lose and murder. GSP mob connection. Jimmy Cournoyer, a 34-year-old Quebec native known as the King of Pot, which is quite the nickname if you ask me, pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges for trafficking over 100,000 kilograms of marijuana and 83 kilograms of cocaine from Canada to the United States, as well as money laundering between 1998 and 2012. His operations were reportedly connected to prominent organized crime figures, including the late Montreal Mafia boss Vito Rizzuto. Born in Laval, Quebec, Jimmy's early years were far from the glamorous image often portrayed in the media. After his parents' separation, he dropped out of high school and took various low-wage jobs, such as working at swimming pools and on candy factories' assembly lines. His criminal record began to mount up in 2001 though, when he was caught in a sting operation attempting to purchase 10,000 ecstasy pills for $65,000 from an undercover officer. In 2004, he was in a tragic car accident whilst driving his Porsche, which resulted in the death of a friend, leading to a combined 72-month prison sentence for the ecstasy charge and the reckless driving cause. Despite these incidences, Jimmy wasn't exactly deterred, but this time he targeted the high-profile life and then somehow started hanging around actors such as Leonardo DiCaprio and fighters such as Georges St-Pierre. Georges St-Pierre provided a rather thoughtful letter in court after he had been caught the second time. George was essentially trying to help out a massive criminal. He described meeting Jimmy in 2009 and forming a close bond over their shared interest in sports, fitness and martial arts. The pair traveled together, including trips to Ibiza, and George visited Jimmy twice during his incarceration. St-Pierre even suggested to the courts that he could get Jimmy a new job and integrated back into society successfully, trying to get a lower sentence for his friend. Anyway, obviously Jimmy was sentenced to 27 years in prison, and after everyone found out George was trying to support this bloke, he retracted his open letter and apologized. But this didn't stop people claiming that Georges St-Pierre is actually an instrument of the mob and was essentially blackmailed into sticking up for the mob's drug mule. Whilst all that sounds far-fetched, it does seem weird that Georges St-Pierre would ever associate with someone like Jimmy. I mean, look at this mugshot. Dude literally looks like an extra from Prison Break. Chris Cyborg is just Wanderlei Silva in heels. So this is it. You've made it all the way to the end of another iceberg. Congratulations. How much did you know? How much have you learnt? Let us know down in the comments section below. But this is unfortunately it for this series, I'm afraid, at least for a couple years until more dark stories emerge, before more conspiracy theories ooze up between the cracks of this most decrepit of communities. The last entry on this iceberg though is truly one of the deepest cuts in the sport, but if you really are paying attention, with your third eye open, you might just realise that Chris Cyborg is indeed Wanderlei Silva in heels.
I said, when I saw her at the MMA Awards, she looked like Wanderlei Silva in a dress and heels. And she did. Didn't she not?